And I think we're good to go. All right. So, hello, everyone. This is, I believe, episode 4. Episode 4 of Design a Play, where today we're going to be talking about Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, the impact that it left on the industry. And this one left a much more noticeable impact on the industry, and there's much stronger lessons to be learned from the release of this game compared to some of the other ones, like, say, Bioshock 2. So we'll just get into the background of the Banjo Kazooie IP itself. We'll go over a brief overview of the IP and the games leading up to the release of this. What's up, Fuddle? Hi. So the first game in the Banjo Kazooie series is Banjo Kazooie. This was released June 29th of 1998, and it was a game made by Rare. Rareware is a company that was most noticeably known for making the Donkey Kong Country games. They made the Diddy Kong Racing game. They made the Killer Instinct series. They created the Battletoads series, and they were the ones who created GoldenEye. The second, I think it's the third highest selling N64 game, only behind Super Mario 64, which was a launch title paired with the console, and Mario Kart. Holy crap, Mario Kart sells gangbusters. It's insane. If you ever go and look at the sales for the games on Nintendo consoles, you would never expect it, but like Mario Kart is almost always at the top, or like in the top 2 or 3. And it's usually like, you know, the number 1, the number 2, and the number 3 is like way down here. Mario Kart is always way high up on the list in terms of sales. It's crazy. So that's one of the reasons it was one of the first games ported to the Switch. When Switch came out, was Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, because they know that is the thing that sells crazy copies, and that is the thing that moves consoles. So, anyway, back to Banjo. Banjo Kazooie has a very long, interesting history and development, and we could have an entire full discussion on it, but I'll just give you a brief overview. I could seriously talk about this for like 3-4 hours, but Banjo Kazooie originally started as an RPG on the SNES. It was heavily inspired by JRPGs and LucasArts films at the times, and it was called Project Dream. The way the gameplay worked is it featured an isometric 2.5D camera, and basically what isometric does, an isometric camera view, makes it so that it angles the camera in a way so you could see things that you wouldn't see if the camera was either just entirely top down or from a side view. So, you know, when the top down camera view, you don't really get a sense of height. And then when it's just straight on, you don't really get a sense of depth. Isometric is kind of like a 45-degree angle, so you get a little bit of each. Obviously, it has its own different problems, but they were going with a kind of like 45-degree angle looking down at the game to get a little bit of both of it. And once the N64 hardware came out to developers, it basically made the graphics technology that Rare was using on the SNES completely obsolete. So they decided to drop all development for Project Dream on the SNES, and they decided at that point to move on over to creating the game on Nintendo 64. So they were working on it, and then finally Super Mario 64, when the console and the game came out, it made Rare realize that the style of game that they were going for and creating just looked completely dated when they saw what SM64 could do with 3D. So they just scrapped everything from that point and just started from scratch. They scrapped everything except for one. The only thing that they kept behind when creating their new game was Banjo. They absolutely fell in love with the model and his character and his personality and everything, so they decided to carry him over. So Project Dream was scrapped, and at this point, this is pretty much the death of Project Dream, and this is the beginning point of Banjo Kazooie. So work started in March of 1997 on this brand new game, and after about a week of toying and trying out some new things, they basically created what looked like the first recognizable Banjo Kazooie level. And from that point on, they continued working. And what was really wild to find out was that it took 17 months and 15 staff members to create and release the game. When you look at the size of the staff members for games nowadays and the development times of like 2 years minimum, 3 years on average for these groups of hundreds of people, the fact that they were able to create and release Banjo Kazooie, one of my favorite games and usually hailed as one of the best games on the N64. They only had 15 people working on it for 17 months, and they were able to release that. And the crazy part is, this was actually after they got a 7-month extension on the game. The game was actually supposed to come out in November of 1997, and they just took that extra 7 months to polish it and clean it up a little bit more. So it really goes to show how much game development has changed from the N64 days. that they were able to release this fantastic game with such a small group of people in such a short window of development time. But the actual timeline for the development of the game is really fascinating. Like I said, we could talk about Banjo Kazooie and the development of the game, just Banjo Kazooie and Project Dream, for hours. It's so cool. True, technically it was not the first game that Banjo appeared in. They did have Banjo in one of the racing games. Was it Diddy Kong Racing? I think it was Diddy Kong Racing. They had Banjo first appear in, and he was one of the racers. It was Diddy Kong Racing, okay. Because I know Conker was in the game, and I couldn't remember if Conker had a racing game, if he was in there. But yeah, Banjo first appeared in Diddy Kong Racing as one of the alternate racers. I actually don't know when Diddy Kong Racing was released. Wow, okay. Diddy Kong Racing came out in November of 1997. Wow, so yeah, that makes sense. Oh, that actually makes total sense, because Diddy Kong Racing came out in November of 1997, and Banjo was originally supposed to release in 1997, the same month as the release of Diddy Kong Racing, so that would have been a perfect coincide of the release of two of them. Interesting. I had no idea about that. So, yeah, no, the first game that Banjo ever actually appeared in was Diddy Kong Racing. His first full-fledged release in a video game, his own video game, was Banjo Kazooie, which is June of 1998, June 29th, very end of the month. So, after Banjo Kazooie follows Banjo Tooie, the second game of the series, and that game came out November 20th of the year 2000. And this game was also made by Rare, and production started in June 1998, immediately after the release of Banjo Kazooie. Also, kind of crazy to think about, you know, when a game comes out, usually developers will work on a game for the next following couple months because they need to update the game. They need to make sure there's any bugs are patched out, that there's future content being released. That usually when a game comes out, devs are working on that game for like 3 to 6 months minimum. And Banjo Kazooie released June 28th. There was I think June has 30 days in the year. That's 2 days left of the month. They didn't even take a break. They immediately went 2 days afterwards, within the 2 days, and started working on the next game, which is crazy. So cool. But it started development in June of 1998, immediately after the release of Banjo Kazooie, and this game was essentially just Banjo Kazooie but bigger. Way bigger. The worlds in the game were 3 times bigger than those of Banjo Kazooie. They were so big that they required warp pads to travel around efficiently. There was over 150 unique characters that were in the game. There were way more the previous moves, every single one of them returned, but they had even more moves on top of it. They had every single world had at least a connection to at least one other world, so the worlds were large and interconnecting with each other. The puzzles to complete, the objectives in each level, they weren't as simple and just straightforward. They usually required they were more require more thought or more time or going across different levels. Every single level had at least one boss in it. It really was just Banjo Kazooie bigger and better. They had transformations for every single level, as opposed to just a couple like they did in Banjo Kazooie. They had a second character specifically for transformations, so that Mumbo could then be a new character you play as, go out in the world, and interact and cast magic in a unique way in every single level. There were more collectibles to find, like they had Cheeto pages in this one. There was supposed to be a 2-player mode that got scrapped very late in development. It was scrapped for time constraints, unfortunately, because it sounded awesome. It was called Bottles Revenge, where player 1 plays the game and player 2 plays as Bottles, where he goes around and since he's dead, he takes control of enemies, and then player 2 tries to kill player 1 with those enemies. And if they do manage to kill player 1, they swap places. So then player 2 becomes Banjo and player 1 becomes Bottles and has to take over enemies and try to kill player 2 so that they could swap places again. Really cool idea. And it was almost finished. It was really late in design, to the point where once modders and hackers found out about this, they could go in and reactivate the code. And it works pretty well. They even had it functioning for Old King Cole, so it was going to be originally where the player 2 could even control bosses and try to kill Banjo, but I think that's probably where the time constraint ran out, because while most of the enemies in the game functioned and worked just fine, they could only get Old King Cole, so they were probably working on the other bosses but couldn't get it done in time. But yeah, Banjo Tooie was meant to just be Banjo Kazooie, but bigger and better, and it was a very ambitious game, to the point that the frame rate was around, on average, 15 FPS. Finally get to watch my favorite streamer talk about the importance of my nuts and bolts. Don't forget. Very important. Hi, Barlden. Yeah, when a game was gold, it was gold. But I imagine, yeah, I guess it's true. Nowadays, when a game is gold, no, so in the industry, when a game goes gold, that basically means it's finished, the product is done and being sent off to be imprinted onto discs. So they can't really make any more changes to the final product because they've sent out the copy, which is going to be mass produced. And usually that would mean in the N64 days, that was it. When a game went gold, it was done. It was finished. It was sent off. It was out of the developer's hands. And at that point, it just became about whatever the release was. Nowadays, when a game is gold, it's sent off to be mass produced, but work is still continuing because they're still working on patching out bugs and fixing issues and making it more optimized and a ton of other things like that because they have online connectivity now. But yeah, I didn't even think about that. Back in the day, when a game was gold, it was gold. That was it. It was done. I didn't even think about that. Huh. So there were two other games in the series. There was Banjo Kazooie Grunty's Revenge, which was a Game Boy Advance game, and they had Banjo Pilots, which was a Game Boy Advance racer game. From what I've heard, Banjo Pilots is kind of just not a very great game. I've heard that Grunty's Revenge is actually a pretty good game. It's just a smaller scaled game compared to the main games, and that its main issue is that it suffers from depth perception, being a platformer on Game Boy Advance. But I didn't have the time to really fully research those, and they're more considered spin-offs more than anything else, as opposed to a main series game. So I also did not set aside time for the development of those, but they did come out. They had Banjo Tooie, they had Grunty's Revenge, and they had Banjo Pilots. These are both on Game Boy Advance, and then for the third and final main series entry that the Banjo series has gotten is Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, the game we'll be talking about. That came out November 11th, 2008. This game was also made by Rare. However, this time it was under the ownership of Microsoft. Rare had been partnered with Nintendo for quite a while. Most of the games that Rare made were Nintendo exclusive games. But surprisingly, when Rare went to Nintendo in a request for Nintendo to purchase Rare, I believe, so that they could get more funding and everything like that, Nintendo declined, surprisingly, despite the fact they had been so close with each other and they'd made so many games for Nintendo. I'm assuming it's because Rare had kind of deviated in their interest in the types of games they were making. They still had made Banjo Kazooie, Banjo Tooie, Donkey Kong 64, and everything like that. But then they started making other games, like they made GoldenEye, they made Perfect Dark, they made Conker's Bad Fur Day. A lot of games that back then were very unlike the types of games that you'll find in Nintendo. So maybe they were just kind of drifting in terms of what they were trying to do with games, and it ended with Nintendo not wanting to purchase Rare, so Rare started shopping around. And the two other companies that they found were interested in purchasing them were Activision and Microsoft. And Microsoft put some money on the table, Activision put some money on the table, and apparently this really kicked Nintendo in the pants. This made them aware of the situation that they were about to lose Rare. Maybe they were just calling their bluff, but Nintendo then stepped into the ring, and it basically became a bidding war between the three. And apparently Rare was initially going to go with Activision, but Microsoft came and slammed their junk on the table with a big ol' offer of money that Rare could not refuse. I believe it was $365 million. And so as of January 2005, Microsoft was now the owner of Rare, and we eventually got Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, which was the first Banjo game that was released by Rare under Microsoft. That was 3 years after the acquisition. So I meant to look this up, but I didn't have enough time. I heard a rumor that Ycraft just brought up, that originally when Microsoft was purchasing Rare, it was originally the reason why they went through with the purchase was because they believed they were going to be purchasing Donkey Kong, because Rare were the ones who exclusively made the Donkey Kong games. They made all the Donkey Kong Country games. They made Donkey Kong 64. I mean, besides the original 1981 release of Donkey Kong on arcade cabinets, pretty much Rare was the one who made every Donkey Kong game. So the rumor that was going around was that Microsoft purchased Rare in a hope that they would, upon purchasing them, own Donkey Kong, the IP. And the one thing I do remember officially seeing was that apparently one of the Microsoft CEOs, upon purchase of Rare, decided to take a tour of the facility and visit them. And while touring around, they saw, posters and everything for all the games that Rare had made. And at one point, one of the CEOs, at one point, he pointed to the poster of Donkey Kong and goes, "Ah, so you made that too?" And they go, "Yeah, we made Donkey Kong 64." And he goes, "We own that now, right?" And he goes, "No, that's owned by Nintendo." And apparently he was a little bit confused. So that was the only evidence that I found in my brief research a couple years back. I can't say whether that's true. I can't confirm it or not. But I wouldn't be completely surprised if that were the case. This was around the year 2000 where video games were finally being realized as something that was lasting. It wasn't just a fad. It wasn't just a kid's thing. It was a serious business. And up until that point, when it came to copyright and ownership of certain products, it was a little bit dicey and kind of the Wild West and not really understood. A lot of this information wasn't tracked. That's why a lot of older games can't be re-released, because these games, besides all the defunct companies, the developers that have been repurposed and acquired by other companies, or other than that just kind of disappeared, or they're with licensed IPs that are owned by completely different studios, or something that's not even related to video games, it becomes this real big mess of a situation. And it was just legally, the understanding of who owned what was not fully understood, and people were not going out of the way to make sure that was understood and established. So I could believe the possibility back in 2000 that maybe they did purchase it, not 2000. I think this is around 2003 they started shopping around. But I could believe that was the original reason why Microsoft threw their hat in the ring, was because they thought maybe they would get Donkey Kong as an ownership. They would own the IP. I can't say for sure, though. The people who were part of the deal did not have that impression. After they bought it and other execs were touring the posters, they saw posters and thought they might have. Execs, not CEOs. Okay. From what you found, okay. That's why I did not want to say specifically that it was true or was not true. That is just what I remember in the past. I am really interested, and I kind of want to spend some time looking into that a little bit more. But thank you, Andy, for your quick light Googling. All right, so that's the general route. That's a quick little background information on the Banjo Kazooie IP. So the three main games, the two spin-offs. Now we can talk about Banjo Nuts and Bolts, the game that I played just this past week. The game we'll be having the discussion on. We can talk about how that game specifically took shape. So Rare had intentions for a while to bring back Banjo at some point. They never thought that the series was dead, or that they were done with it, or they weren't going to come back. They knew they wanted to come back and do another Banjo game. They just wanted to wait for the right time, for the right idea. And apparently their original goal with doing another Banjo game is they wanted to try a different approach to platformers. So why did Rare make all the DK games? Nintendo just like them? What do you mean? What do you mean, why did they make all the DK games? Are you talking about the reason why Nintendo chose Rare to make the N60 to make the Donkey Kong Country games? Because I don't know the answer to that. I have not researched that. We probably should do we probably should do a Donkey Kong game. The original Donkey Kong Country games are pretty significant, where their graphics even look decent by today's standards. Because the way they did it was they basically made full 3D models of the characters and scaled them down to a polygon, as opposed to making sprites in each shape, where apparently the quality of the polygons and the amount of frames that they had available for each animation was so high and such high quality that they actually had to cut certain frames off just to make it more realistic, or not as uncanny valley, and work with the hardware. But if you're asking why Nintendo picked Rare, I don't know specifically. I'm actually curious about that too, because Rare is, it was a UK-based company. It was a huge deal when Retro took over for making Metroid Prime, because that was a not Nintendo, that was not a Nintendo first-party company. That was not a Japan-based company, and that was a big deal. I imagine it was also a huge deal when they decided to go to a UK-based company to have the development for Donkey Kong. That's a good question, James. I don't know. Now I'm curious about that. Can someone post on Discord to remind me to look that up? Because I'm curious myself. But Rare had an intention of bringing back Banjo at some point, but their motivation for wanting to bring back Banjo was to try to evolve platformers in some way. They felt that the formula of platformers hadn't really changed for quite some time, that it was pretty much the same thing. And so once they decided to bring back Banjo, it was because they wanted to tweak him a little bit to make sure to change how people approached or looked at platformers and how they were done. So the original pitched idea for Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts at the very beginning was it was actually going to be a type of remake of Banjo Kazooie, the original one, where they were going to take place in like the same worlds and the same locations, but things would play just a little bit differently. And as time would go on, they would change even more. So you would go to Spiral Mountain and you would fight Conga. You would shoot to exit him, and Conga would consciously and say he was aware of their previous fights that they had. But they realized upon making more of the game that it was really difficult for them to get it across that there wasn't just a reskin or an HD texture update of a re-release of Banjo-Kazooie. It was hard to sell to gamers and sell to the public that this is not just a remake, this is a new game, but it's based on the original one very heavily with some slight changes. So since that was a very hard thing for them to communicate in the game, they decided to drop that idea. So their next idea that they tried to run with in creation with the game was they were really emphasizing the Grunty versus Banjo archetype, where Grunty would actually be in all the levels, and it would be a Grunty, a character that was controlled by AI, and it was trying to complete the same tasks as Banjo's, essentially. So she would try to collect notes, she would try to collect Jiggies before Banjo could. She would basically try to interfere with the player's progress. This idea also eventually had to be scrapped because the main bottleneck, the issue, was they could not get the complexity and the intelligence of the AI to a level where it would produce the desired results and experience in games. So because the AI just wasn't able to confidently and accurately get the end result they wanted, they had to drop that idea as well. So once they dropped that idea, they decided to instead focus on understanding how players traveled in platformers. Because again, they were still trying to go with the original idea of trying to evolve platformers and make it something a little bit different so it could break the mold a little bit. So they focused on how players traveled in platformers, and then they tried to do something. They were trying to make it so that traveling to the next objective was just as fun as completing the objective. And in the process of trying to figure that out, someone suggested the idea of an interactive Lego set. And they really liked the idea, and they started to run with it. And that is pretty much the point at which the vehicle kind of thing, the vehicle approach started coming in, the mechanic, and that really just evolved into Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts that we see today. Or DK64 with a ship with a memory expansion because more RAM was a workaround to a game-breaking bug. Yeah, I think it was DK64 where the game only worked with more expansion because there was a bug and they could not pinpoint the bug specifically. When you had played Donkey Kong 64 without the expansion pack, the game would crash and they could not figure out why specifically that was. So they did find out, though, that when you played with the RAM expansion, the game worked fine. It did not crash. So they ended up making the tough decision of shipping the game with the memory pack because they could not figure out the bug in time. That's why Donkey Kong 64 was shipped with the expansion pack. It worked out, though, because now everyone had an expansion pack to play Majora's Mask, one of my favorite games, my favorite Zelda game. So now, before we've gotten up to the point of the early stages of development of Banjo-Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, talked about the IP, so now we're going to talk about the games that were coming out around the time of Banjo's Nuts and Bolts' release to kind of get an idea for what games were coming out at the time, what the climate of gaming, what genre was more emphasized, or what people were looking for, what was in high demand, and everything like that. So Banjo came out in November of 2008. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the 6 months before it came out and the 6 months after, because it's in that middle period right there. And Banjo Nuts and Bolts was a very unique game, really unique type of gameplay, and it didn't have really many direct competitors. Leading up to the release of Nuts and Bolts, we had the release of Wii Fit, Metal Gear Solid 4, Devil May Cry 4, we had Braid, that huge indie hit, came out. We had Rock Band 2, we had Guitar Hero World Tour. The first release in the Dead Space series came out. We had Fallout 3, and this was just the year of twos. We had, again, in the 6 months leading up to Banjo, we had Saints Row 2 come out, Far Cry 2 come out, Fable 2 come out, Gears of War 2 come out, and we also had Rock Band 2. So, oh yeah, you're right. Change the topic. Thank you for reminding me. Forgot to do that. Good call. Totally forgot about that. All right. So, yeah, it was just the year of twos. Apparently, this was the year of sequels. So many sequels. All big games, all well-known games, but I guess this was just a couple years after the a lot of different IPs were introduced, and they decided to run with sequels. So those were the games that were leading up to the release of Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts that weren't competitors, because I mean, you had a lot of shooters. You had Metal Gear Solid, you had Dead Space, you had Far Cry, you had Gears, you had Fallout, and this was also the music age, because we had I forgot, this is around when Guitar Hero and Rock Band were at their high points. You had a couple odd different games out there like Wii Fit. We had Braid, which was a platformer, but there really weren't a whole lot of platformers around this time. But leading up to the couple months before Banjo, like I said, it's a very different type of game, so there isn't really a whole lot of direct competitors to it. But the ones I would consider competitors would be Spore and Little Big Planet, because of the types of games they are. So Spore was an interesting little game where you start as a single-cell creature that would grow bigger until you got to a multi-cell organism, and once that happened, you would crawl up on land, and you would take your character and edit them, their arms, their legs, their body shapes and everything, until they became a creature that would then evolve and then become a tribe, and then evolve and become a city, and then eventually go into space for space exploration. It was divided into these 5 or 6 segments. The reason why I see it almost as a competitor to Banjo Nuts and Bolts is Banjo Nuts and Bolts is all about creativity. It's about, you know, creating your character. You can put however many eyes you want in there. You can put however many arms. You can change the shape and direction of them and the sounds they make and their mannerisms and their personality. It's all about creativity and expression. Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts is that same exact way, but the difference is with Spore, once you create your character, you can tweak and you can change them, but once you usually get past a certain stage, you're pretty much stuck with that. That is the creature that you have for the rest of the game. Whereas Banjo Nuts and Bolts, you create a vehicle. If it doesn't work, you can either scrap it entirely brand new, or you can make some tweaks and changes to it. When you're done with that challenge, you may never use that vehicle again, or you could use it for a bunch of different challenges. But if you don't use it again, you go into the next challenge and you have to start a brand new one as well. Where Spore is kind of taking your, it's more about expression and personality being shown in a character, whereas Banjo Kazooie is just more about creativity overcoming a challenge. But they are still similar types of feelings and experiences, I think, in video games, where they're both about creation, an emphasis on creation. We have Little Big Planet is the other game that I would call more of a competitor to Banjo Kazooie, and more of a direct competitor, because Little Big Planet was its main single player experience was just a simple basic platformer. It had a lot of personality and charm and quirkiness, but it was just a basic 2D platformer, 2.5D platformer. But the multiplayer, the long lasting content was the level creator, and that was all about player created content where they would create the levels. It was very similar to Mario Maker. And this was, again, just like Banjo Kazooie, where it's a ton of creativity and expression for the content that you create the levels. The difference is Banjo Kazooie, it was about creating, you were given a mission to complete and you created the solution, whereas Little Big Planet was about creating the objective and creating the mission and letting other people try to complete the solution. Also, when it comes to the solution, that was the same. You were Sackboy. You had the same basic platforming and grabbing mechanics that everyone had every time. Whereas Banjo Nuts and Bolts, you had near limitless tools at your fingertips to try to solve the solution. So it's kind of like the roles were backwards, where, you know, Banjo was creating the solution, whereas Little Big Planet was about creating the obstacle or the objective. So again, very similar, but still not quite the exact same, but I would still consider it a competitor to Banjo Nuts and Bolts, just because of similar experiences. Spore lost so much of what it was supposed to be due to being rushed out. So I've heard. I don't know. I haven't researched Spore too much, so I don't know what was originally promised. I enjoyed Spore when I played it, but that was probably because I had no idea what the hell Spore was. My sister's husband just came over one day with it on his laptop, and then I was watching him and I asked if I could play. So whenever he wasn't playing, I played, and I loved it. I had so much fun with it. So I had no idea what was promised, what was told was coming for us or anything like that. But I enjoyed it. But yeah, that's generally what I've heard, is that the game was a letdown, and I'm assuming it's because of what is promised. So I guess like a No Man's Sky kind of situation. Sorry for changing. Hey, what's up, Lewis? Sorry for changing the topic. I was thinking, is it normal for a company like Nintendo to partner up with a company that doesn't own such... They don't own such as rare instead of using a company they have internally? Yes, that would be a third-party developer. So first-party developers are studios that are owned by the company. So, for example, Microsoft now owns Double Fine. Anything that Double Fine releases for the Xbox console is considered a first-party release. Third-party releases, I think second-party releases are a thing, and I think that's the classification that Rare was when Nintendo originally, where pretty much everything that Rare made was released for Nintendo, but Nintendo didn't explicitly own them. I think also that's Naughty Dog. I think now Sony owns Naughty Dog, but for a while, almost everything that Naughty Dog released was exclusively for PlayStation. So I think that's correct. I haven't really had to be brought up in a while, but I think second party exists. And third party is the typical thing. Third party is usually just, third party would be Bethesda. Bethesda, they make Fallout 76, let's say, and it's released for PlayStation, it's released for Xbox. They're a third-party developer, so they make a game that goes to anyone else. When it comes to a certain company owning an IP and going to another outside company and giving them to make it, I don't think that's incredibly common, but I don't think it's very rare. I don't know if 343 Studios is owned by Microsoft or not. Or I think they are now, but when they originally started making the Halo series, starting from Halo 5, I don't know if they were owned by them. So that would be another example. Yeah, Sony bought them. Oh no, Insomniac. Oh, okay, gotcha. Yep, Sunset Overdrive. I was thinking that was Naughty Dog. I don't know why I get Insomniac and I get Naughty Dog confused a lot, because I think they make some similar games. Because what was it? Naughty Dog made Spyro and they made Crash, I think. But then Insomniac made Ratchet and Clank, or like there's a lot of like they made games that were similar to each other. So I get the two developers confused a lot. Kind of second party. Yeah, Nintendo owned a large majority of Rare, but not the entirety of them. But when it comes to a company owning an IP and then going to someone else and having them develop it for them, I don't think that happens incredibly often. It's not a super rare thing. It's very rare for Nintendo. But that's what's been happening with the Warhammer series. There's that's a whole different thing. But basically, a very short summary of it. Warhammer's an IP that's mostly, it's like a board game type of thing. And they have gone and they've basically taken the Warhammer IP and they've chopped it up into hundreds of little pieces. And they've just shopped it out to everyone. And to any developer they had for a year, any developer who wanted to work with it, they pretty much said yes to every single person. Depending on the reputation of whoever was approaching them, they gave her larger chunks or smaller chunks of whatever the Warhammer IP was. Like larger chunks would get access to entire huge cities, whereas people who hadn't proved themselves yet, they would get like one or two like generic, really basic characters. And then the trade-off was that they had to title it a Warhammer game. And basically, when you had this massive flux of Warhammer games come in, they had they had a lot of great games. Like they had Vermintide came out, and God, it's been a while since I've researched this, so I don't remember the other huge Warhammer games. But there was a lot of flops. There was a lot of really bad garbage games. But there was a lot of good games, and when they had this massive influx of games, they could really shine a spotlight on the good games and just kind of brush aside the bad games and ignore them. So that ended up working out for them, because now the Warhammer IP is a lot more prevalent and has more positive association with it, even though they were going under, and it's probably helping their IP. But if there is examples of a company owning a game and shopping their IP out to other developers and other groups for them to make something of it. So it does happen. I actually shared the game engines for the PlayStation 2 games. Yeah, they look pretty similar too. And the same office building? Holy crap. Yeah, I just constantly get the two of them confused. That would be, I could get them separate in my mind, but I would have to actively like spend time trying to separate the two of them, and it's just something that's never really had to come up. But, so those were the games leading up to the release of Banjo Nuts and Bolts. And this is the following 6 months we had some more releases, because Banjo came out in November, and usually mid-November to December is the holiday season. That's where the big juicy meaty games come out. So leading up to the first 6 months, we still had some big games. You know, we had Gears of War, we had Metal Gear Solid 4, we had the first Dead Space game. There were a lot of releases coming out, but the following 6 months, we had a lot of big hitters coming out. So the 6 months after Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts came out, we had Call of Duty World at War came out. We had the first Mirror's Edge game, the first Left 4 Dead game came out. Persona 4 came out. We had, again, continuing to the year of twos, we had Skate 2 came out. Fear 2 was released. We had Killzone 2. We had the fan favorite, the universally acclaimed and beautifully loved Resident Evil 5 came out. We had Flower, that really artsy indie game that led to, I believe that was the one that came out before, not Destiny, Journey. Kind of like a spiritual predecessor to Journey. We had the first Infamous game came out, and Pokemon Platinum came out. So again, more, this was just the rise of shooters pretty much. We had, Call of Duty World at War was released, Left 4 Dead was out, Fear 2, Killzone 2, Resident Evil 5, tons of huge shooters. But there really, again, wasn't a whole lot of direct competition to Banjo Nuts and Bolts, because Banjo Nuts and Bolts, as I said, is that creative game. It's the one that's an emphasis on the players being creative and trying to overcome their obstacles in many different ways. And there wasn't a whole lot of that. But the other half of Banjo was still, I think it deviated a little bit more than they originally intended from the platforming genre, but there still definitely is platforming elements in there. But there really wasn't any platformers that came out within that year. Nintendo didn't really release much, and I think that was because Mario Galaxy came out in 2007, so they were quite a ways away from releasing another big platformer. So Banjo didn't have a whole lot of direct competition in that field. So those are the games that came out the 6 months following Banjo's release that were not really competitors, just major releases. Because again, I still think it is important to consider that in the 6 months before after release, even if they're not direct competitors in terms of genre, there are consumers who will jump that gap. They do different genres. I love Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. I love Overwatch. I love Dead by Daylight. All completely very different games from each other, but I still love them all. And I only have a set amount of disposable income I can do each year. So this was a big year that had a lot of different games. So while they aren't direct competitors to each other, people still only have a set amount of money to spend each year. So in a year with big releases, I still think while it's not a direct competitor, it still is an influence on how games do. So that was the games that weren't direct competitors in types of gameplay style. But for the 6 months that came after Banjo, the games I would consider somewhat competitors would be Animal Crossing City Folk and the first publicly available version of Minecraft. So Animal Crossing City Folk, while it's a game about player customization, expression through your villager and your house and your town, setting up your furniture, giving yourself your certain outfits, inviting or excommunicating certain villagers, maybe giving them outfits to try to make them look a certain way. And it's all about, player expression and creativity. There's just like there are tons of different parts and combinations of vehicle parts for Nuts and Bolts, there are tons of different combinations of furniture and wallpaper and flooring and villagers and flowers and all these different ways you could express yourself and combine stuff in Animal Crossing City Folk, just like you could with Banjo. It's not as mechanically complex or challenging of a game, but I still think there is some kind of similar parts. And then Minecraft, while it was fully released in, I believe, 2011, the first publicly available version of Minecraft came out May 17th, 2009, so it was 5 months after Banjo's release. And I would definitely consider this a type of competitor to Nuts and Bolts, because it is all about exploration and combining different things to create different results, either aesthetically, Banjo's about building vehicles. Minecraft could be about building an entire city. So there is definitely some comparisons between the two. And this was also, I thought maybe this was, Minecraft just became first publicly available, so it was really quiet and, under the radar, and a lot of people didn't know about it. But I looked, and in the year of 2009, Minecraft was like the third highest rated game or the fourth highest rated game for the entire year by multiple different reviewers. So it was definitely a game that had attention. It had widespread appeal that people knew of. So I just popped in to just talk about how Little Big Planet was also released in 2008. Yes, it did. We briefly talked about how it came out actually a week before Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts came out. I think it was a week. It was very shortly beforehand. But how they are very similar to each other because they are about player creation. However, Banjo is about creating the solution, whereas Little Big Planet is about creating the obstacles. So there is comparison to each other. They're kind of just opposite sides of a coin. Minecraft didn't get building creation for a while, really. I kind of figured the whole prospect of building, taking blocks and placing them on top of each other. Vehicle creation, what about it? Yeah, I kind of assume the idea of taking blocks and placing them on top of each other in other ways that you could creatively think was kind of like a day one thing from Minecraft. That is me just making an assumption, and I should have double checked that, but I assume that was the case. Oh, no. Yeah, no. I'm talking about Banjo was about vehicle creation, whereas Minecraft was about creation in general. I'm not directly comparing vehicles and vehicles. I'm just talking about Minecraft was about player creation and creativity and expression. Banjo Nuts and Bolts is about creativity and creating your vehicles and expressing yourself through that as well, but by means of overcoming the obstacle, whereas Minecraft is about just, I do know as time went on, Minecraft did give you more objectives and more missions to do, but I imagine in the early stages it was more just about building the game itself, and so it wasn't really as objective based. It was about just the experience and getting the engine and everything working. Didn't have creative building, so it didn't have the creative mode. It had like a survival mode where you could still build stuff, but they didn't just have a mode focused on creating. I understand that. Still think it's a direct competitor. Definitely doesn't make it as easy, but it still existed. Minecraft Alpha didn't have survival. It was just creative. Interesting. I probably should look into that. I really should look into Minecraft. Just with how universal it is, and it's clearly influential. I probably should do some research into Minecraft at some point. And I'm sure Kung Fu and Bird and everyone would love for me to start picking up Minecraft and playing that too. Okay. So we have, up to this point, discussed a couple different things. We've talked about the background and information about the Banjo Kazooie IP, the three main games. Talked about how Banjo Kazooie went from being a basic typical platformer to the vehicle type of creation. And we talked about the games that came out around the release of Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. So the next thing we'll talk about is the final product, what we actually got of Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. We'll break it down, talk about different aspects of the game's design. Is there anything anyone else wants to bring up or discuss or talk about before we get to that point? Come on. There we go. The evolution of Minecraft is interesting. I just worried that's going to be the difficult part to keep track of. Because I imagine trying to research and try to look up any information about Minecraft, I imagine there's so many different articles and sites and pieces on the web that talk about Minecraft. Being able to sift through the evolution of it is probably going to be really difficult to do. And also, I imagine that there's just so much to talk about. It'd be hard to get what would be considered major points of interest to talk about, because what would be considered a major point of interest, I feel like, is something you really have to be there for to know the before and after. Well, that's the thing, Divine. Like, talking about in patch notes, there is, I'm sure, you know, there could be 6-month stretches where they added a couple minor things here and there, but nothing really major, and it's kind of hard to tell the difference between what would be considered major and what would be considered minor, because it's one of those things where you don't know it until it's gone. I would think like, oh, without this mechanic couldn't be that bad, but once, you know, if I'd been there from the beginning and seen how drastically the game changed once they added one more mechanic, it could be, you know, an entire difference of what would basically feel like a new game. Like Pocket and console. Yep. I would probably, if I were to talk about it, I would probably talk about the development of like the beta to the release more than anything else. I don't know. That could be something. Minecraft development pushes mostly weekly patches before major release, slowly sending out content for the community to test as to whether or not something is major. Just ask someone who plays. I could do that, but I still think that original issue I brought up still is a valid concern. Where, you know, maybe they were there from the beginning. Maybe they weren't. But okay, opt-in beta. So it's like a PTR kind of thing, playtest, region playtest server. All right. So moving on to the actual final product that we got with Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. It was originally started. It was originally called Banjo Kazooie, Banjo Buildy. Sorry. They decided to scrap that name because they felt that it followed the formula of how they named games previously in the first two games too similarly, whereas Banjo Nuts and Bolts was such a huge deviation in terms of the experience from the first two games that they felt it was not a good way to go with the naming. So they decided to scrap Banjo Buildy and make Banjo Nuts and Bolts. So tons of different things to talk about with the final release of the game. Obviously, vehicles are a huge one, but I think we'll get to that later. I want to talk about a couple other things first, and the first thing I want to talk about is the hub. Ironically, I feel that name would have felt less deceptive and more spin-off-y. I don't know. I think Banjo Buildy definitely is more direct in its name as telling you what you're doing with building, but I also feel like Banjo Nuts and Bolts definitely feels like a bigger deviation in their formula when it comes to naming games compared to, like, Banjo Buildy does feel like the naming convention they've done for the first two games, where they did Banjo Kazooie and then Banjo Tooie and then kind of Banjo Buildy, where they start with the first word being the same and then they have the second name kind of a bastardized version almost of a word. Whereas Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, you know, with the colon and, you know, Banjo Kazooie and then adding an extra title onto the end definitely does make it feel like more of a spin-off type of thing. I don't know. I could see either one be working. When I heard Nuts and Bolts, it made me think it wasn't following the rest really. Same. I feel like if it was Banjo Buildy, it would be kind of going in that same direction from, I mean, first impressions are huge, and when it comes to a title, that can be huge as well. Oh, absolutely. Tons of people are. And we'll talk about that as well. But that's one of the biggest criticisms and angers that people had towards the game, Mally, was expecting Banjo 3 on release. But we'll talk about that because I have an entire timeline of the advertising and information leaked, or the information drippage from Rareware on the game. Buildy, I think, wouldn't have had as much of a problem, I think. I don't know. I think it could go either way. I think it's better. I think it was better to do Nuts and Bolts. I think that's more direct and obvious of a spin-off compared to Banjo Buildy, but I can totally see your viewpoint for the opposite reason too. For the opposite perspective. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about with Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts is the hub world. The hub was the first time the devs had an opportunity to create a larger, living, breathing, organic type of world for the Banjo Kazooie universe. In, you know, previous Banjo games, the hub was essentially just a vacuum. It was a means of travel between the different worlds. Sorry, the puppy is just here wanting attention. Yeah, in the previous games, Banjo Kazooie and Banjo Tooie, the hub was a means to just get from point A to point B to get to the next levels. Whereas Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts was its basically a full-fledged world. In Banjo, the first two games, there were, you know, the occasional collectibles. You know, they usually had at least one, the equivalent to one Jiggy inside of them in between each level. They were mostly, they did add to a type of world building where they do expand and add to the feeling and the atmosphere of Grunty's lair. They do add to the world of the Isle of Hags in Banjo Tooie, making it feel like a real world. But as a whole, it definitely just feels like their own mini just connecting points between levels. Hydration check. The hub in Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts felt a lot more alive. It was their chance to create what was essentially a universe, a living location inside the Banjo universe, which was awesome. It had it had a lot more characters that made it feel more alive, instead of just where in the previous games they would kind of just have one or two characters in a certain location just to populate whatever objective is in that area. So, you know, you have Showdown Town, which is the name of the hub in Banjo Nuts and Bolts, which is a full-fledged town populated with tons of different, you know, creatures and living animals. Whereas in, you know, let's say Banjo Tooie, for example, we have Jolly Roger's Bay, where they have, it's a town, it's, you know, a small town, but all it has is Jolly Roger running the bar. It has the radioactive pigs by the water, and then it has, I can't even remember his name. It has the skunk running the pawn shop, and it has Blubber running the ski shop. Once you buy the boat from Blubber, he's gone. I think once you buy the things in the pawn shop, Pawnee, that's his name, I think he's gone as well. But an entire full town only has like 4 or 5 characters. Definitely felt a lot more empty compared to the hustle and bustle type of feeling in Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. Granted, the characters are meant to just be kind of living creatures there to fill the space. Once you actually talk to them, they're great for the occasional one-liner joke and everything like that. But once you start talking to them regularly, you realize they're just there to fill space. So I wish they had done a little bit more with it, but I can't disagree with the fact that it definitely felt the world feel more alive as opposed to the earlier Banjo games, which felt a lot more deserted. And this also, Showdown Town, the hub in Banjo Nuts and Bolts, is probably the most, it's definitely the most similar to the previous Banjo games. So it's this large explorable location that's blocked off in progression points by requiring upgrades. So, you know, in Grunty's hub, you need certain moves. You need like the talent shot to get up slopes, or you need the spring jump to reach up on certain ledges and stuff like that. It was, the Showdown Town has similar progression points that wall it off. You have the slopes you need gripping tires for. You need flotation devices to get across the water. So it's very similar in design to that. There were tons of collectibles. Well, there are collectibles in the levels, but we'll talk about that later. When it comes to Showdown Town, the hub is littered with notes all over the place. There's crates to find and bring back. There are the Jiggy tamper switches, certain locations that when you find them, they just give you an extra Jiggy, that all of them reward emphasis on exploration. And there's also tons of climbing and platforming, all the different buildings and the houses and the rooftops and the wires to bounce across and climb up on. The Showdown Town definitely feels so much like a typical Banjo level, and it was a very welcome addition. I remember when I did my playthrough and I got, anytime I got like a progression upgrade for my vehicle so I had access to new locations, I remember I would spend about an hour and a half just going around exploring the new places that we had in the hub world before we even went back into a level and continue doing the main meat of the content, the objectives, because the hub was just such a fun place. So it was a nice little callback where, you know, they have their new things that they do in the game, but they still have a location that's heavily like the previous Banjo games. Pawn shop owner was Pawno, not Pawnee. Pawno. I was close. So moving on from the hub, we go into the levels. So in Banjo Kazooie, they had 9 levels. In Banjo Tooie, they had 8 levels. And in Banjo Nuts and Bolts, they only have 5 fully constructed levels. Like I discussed, the hub in itself felt a lot like a level, which was a lot better, as I said, also from the Banjo Kazooie and Banjo Tooie, where it is just originally a means to get from level to level. The hub felt like a full-fledged level. So we had the 5 fully constructed levels. We have the hub, which I consider like a 6th level. And then they have the Spiral Mountain is in this game, and that serves as just a final location for the boss battle. So 5 fully constructed levels. They have the hub world, and then they have a boss level. Something that I really, really loved about Spiral Mountain and how they did the boss battle in this game. In my opinion, I believe a final boss is a test of your abilities up until that point to prove that you've honed and fully mastered and understood the mechanics they've given in the game. It's supposed to be a final test. Now that you're at the end of the game, do you understand everything at your disposal? And the way they did it at Spiral Mountain is they almost kind of did it as like 2 boss fights. So one of them is the required boss fight to beat the game. One is an optional, where Log, who is the Lord of Games, one of the characters in the game, we'll discuss more about him later, but he runs an objective, a challenge to do in there, where you have to do 6 missions all in succession immediately after each other with 1 vehicle for all 6 of them. And if you fail at any point, you lose. And then they have Grunty, who is the final boss fight, who is required to complete the game. And she has a gauntlet, a marathon race where you battle her, and she has 5 or 6 different vehicles where you have to take on the different vehicles in different locations, whether it's driving, flying, in the water. And it's also the same thing. It requires you to use 1 vehicle, and you have to do it for all 6 of these challenges. And if you fail any one of them, you fail the entire thing. So basically, they have Grunty, who her final challenge is focused on the combat aspect, creating a vehicle that is able to take her to show that you have a mastery of the offensive building when it comes to your vehicles. And then you have Log, who when they have their 6 challenges, it's basically a test of your functionality when it comes to building vehicles. So you have basically what's 2 final boss fights, the way that they split them perfectly, instead of just focusing on one or ignoring the other, or trying to force the 2 together in a very incoherent type of way. They split them up. I think it was a perfect job to have essentially 2 boss fights, one for the combat aspects and one for the functionality aspects, and I absolutely loved it. Such a good approach to how they did the final boss battle in the game, and the final level in its entirety. Now, notice the final boss is supposed to be a formality because you've been preparing for and have defeated the 10 times harder EX bosses already. This is not a JRPG. This is not an RPG, okay? This is a completely different game, Mally. Hi, Lemur. How are you doing? So, we have the 5 levels, we have the hub, and then we have the final boss location. So we talked about how many levels they have. Let's talk about the actual levels themselves, and the fact that the levels are broken up into acts. Very, very different from the previous Banjo games. So in the previous Banjo games, in Banjo Kazooie and Banjo Tooie, when you enter a level, there's 1 entrance and there's 1 exit. And when you enter into the level, that's the level in its entirety. That's everything it has to offer. And, in Banjo Kazooie, in all except for 2 instances, when you enter a level, you can fully complete the game and then leave in one go. Banjo Tooie, pretty much all the levels you enter, you can get about 80% of the level done, but you would have to come back later either with new moves, or you would have to do something in a later level that will then come back and have some kind of interaction with the previous level, which will get you a Jiggy then, but still the same premise. You enter into a level and you exit from a level in the same place, and no matter, because it's 1 entrance and 1 exit, that's the full game. With Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, as you obtain more Jiggies, you unlock more levels, and you unlock more access to the level. This is going to be a little bit complicated. This is kind of hard to explain just by speaking, so I will try my best to explain this. But when you get a certain amount of Jiggies, you obtain a sphere that you take to a location, and it opens up a level. It opens up Act 1, because the levels are broken into acts. But the way that you unlock them and continue to unlock them goes kind of back and forth or all over the place. So you will get, when you obtain 7 Jiggies in the game, you unlock the 2nd act in the 3rd level. Then when you collect 1 more Jiggy, you unlocked the 4th act in the 1st level. So by collecting 1 more, you collect a Jiggy, you will unlock more access to the 3rd level, but when you collect 1 more Jiggy, you unlock more access to the 1st level. Very kind of weird, very odd, but there's some benefits to this type of system. The way that they have done the mission structure in this game is they've made it so when you go into a level, one of the NPCs will give you a mission, and they have only a certain set amount of NPCs in the game. And when they split up the game into acts, it makes it so they can basically reuse those NPCs instead of having to create a whole new large swath of characters in order to be, people who give out certain mission or objectives. It's a nice resource and time saver to make it so they're not having to create a whole bunch of new NPCs and the character that comes along with them and their animations and so on and so forth. It makes it so there in the average level, there's about 20 missions that are giving out. and it makes it so it feels less cluttered if they go by an act system. It could definitely be argued that as the levels are right now, because they are so large and expansive, that they do feel a little bit more empty or lonely. But because each level has on average 20 missions, I think it could also be argued that the levels would just be so cluttered if they had taken the level and plopped down 20 characters all throughout the map. It would almost look like an Assassin's Creed mini map with all the different things to collect and interact at one time, and it kind of just draws your attention by forcing you to see like, oh, there's a character right there, I'm gonna go right there, as opposed to the natural exploration aspect they go for in game. So either one, it could be argued either way, whether your preference of feeling the levels are too lonely or too empty. But it could also be argued that they would feel too cluttered if they just dropped everyone down in there. I think a better mix of maybe like 10 characters per act could have worked, but we got what we got. It also lets them reuse a smaller set of characters. Exactly. So one thing I think that's very important that I have not seen anyone discuss about this helps reinforce the experiences of the levels. Like I said with Banjo Kazooie and almost all the levels, when you enter into a level and you complete it, you leave, and that's it. Then you're done. I think a lot of people tend to remember their experiences in the levels because they played the game as a kid, they played when they were younger, and they played multiple times. You know, as a kid, you tend to remember stuff more, but also as a kid, you tend to replay stuff more. And that reinforcement, the repeating of playing the game over and over, you tend to build those stronger memories to the game. Now, if they released a game and someone played it, I feel like if you go in, play it once, beat the level once, and then leave, you're not going to have a stronger connection to those levels. With the act-based system, you go into the level, you complete it, you leave, and then you come back later because there's another act of missions to do. And the process of leaving the levels and re-entering and re-exploring and looking for the new NPCs and finding out what you need to do, I think help reinforces the idea of the experiences and the memories that you have of that game become much stronger. I mean, it's just repetition in general helps build stronger associations, and I think that the act system makes it so people actually remember the experiences playing the games a lot more than they would have in the previous games. And arguably the most important and the biggest reason why they did do the act-based system and how it affects the game design is it lets them scale challenges. So you look at, for example, we look at Mumble Mountain, and maybe they think maybe the devs thought of a fun challenge or an objective they could do, but it would be a lot more difficult. They realize they can't do that. They basically have to drop that idea because it's the first level. It is the introductory to that level. They can't really do anything that would be considered difficult because it would be unfair to the player. So maybe they could possibly reuse that idea in a different level, but for, you know, platformers and games like Banjo, they are a lot of them based on the environment around them, and it definitely can be kind of crappy to have to restrict yourself to easier type of challenges because of the order in which you take these levels. But the way that they do the act structure, they can make it so there are challenges, and maybe the fourth act of the first level will be harder than the first act in the third level. So it allows them to make harder challenges in earlier levels, so you actually have a reason to go back and it feels more fun, but they can have better access to explore the ideas in the level. It also makes it so they can scale the challenge as the game goes on. Again, they don't just plop these difficult missions on top of you in the beginning of the first level. Oops, music's over. Let's go to Banjo Kazooie music. Instead of they have the option to make it so they can make these difficult objectives, but then make it so you need to unlock a certain amount of jiggies that prove you have played through the game and understand it a little bit more. And it can help with the scaling of the difficulty as time goes on. So in terms of game balance design and difficulty progression, the act-based system is fantastic. I love the idea that, you know, you can play through a level and love the aesthetic, but it's just too simple and too easy that it doesn't really engage you. Even though you love the setting and you love the locale, they have the ability to think of and add harder objectives that can challenge you, and you can experience it in a location that you want. I really, really love the act-based system. I think it's great. It's kind of why JRPGs where you revisit the same towns a lot leave more marked than ones, exactly the ones that are more linear. The ones that you are, like, that's why, I mean, for example, RuneScape, I will, until the day I die, remember Lumbridge, I will remember Varrock, I will remember Draenor. you know, all these different places that I've been to multiple times. Falador, like these names will never leave my brain because I've been there so many times, even though they are early locations that you experience early in the game. There are reasons to come back, and those names and those experiences just get drilled in your brain, and they're much more memorable. Exactly. Banjo Kazooie had to pad out a game to the extreme to compensate for a small cartridge space. How would you say it was padded out? I feel like it could be more argued that Banjo Tooie would be more padded out with things like there's the Jiggy and Pterodactyl Land where there's Drippy, who's stuck in his little hole and he's so thirsty, he's dying of thirst, and you can't do anything until you go to the final level and you enter you break a rock so the water falls from this floating cup and it drops into his bowl for Drippy, and he immediately gives you the Jiggy. I feel like if anything that would seem almost like padding, where there's just a thing here and you spend a bunch of time wondering how the heck did you beat it, how the hell you save it, how you complete this objective, and it goes, oh, you just do that later, kind of thing. I'm just wondering how Banjo Kazooie could be seen as padding, and I'm not like obviously trying to start shit or being a fanboy. I'm just genuinely curious. So those are the levels specifically. Next thing we can talk about is the characters and the art style that they went for with this game. So this was the first HD Banjo game, and this is the first time that they went into, they brought Banjo into full 3D, HD, high definition quality and everything. And originally they tried making Banjo and Kazooie as that, with full high-res 3D, but they realized early on that they just kind of lacked the charm that they had in the early, more polygon type of design days. And so they instead tried a different idea where they tried higher resolution but lower polygon count. And it ended up with this more cuboid type of shape to him. And they liked it. They thought it was great. They thought it helped express his personality. He could be much more expressive and emotive. And this led into the rest of the design of the game because it fit perfectly with Banjo being more cuboid shaped, where at this point they had leaned into the idea of trying to make it more it was a vehicle building type of game where the characters were building the vehicles, and so they had a lot of cuboid shapes and a building type of aesthetic wanting to go into the game. And with Banjo being cuboid, they realized this worked really great, and so they decided to design the rest of the game in a similar type of aspect. Padding is having to exchange things for Triforce pieces in the original Wind Waker. Yeah. I don't know. I feel like, if anything, I feel like the original Banjo is relatively short. I remember seeing an interview where they said that they believed the original experience for someone playing for the first time would take about 40 hours, but they even said once someone realizes where everything is after those 40 hours, the game could be completed in like 3 hours. I was like, holy crap, that's wild that they just outwardly admit that in a it was a regular interview. This was about 6 months before the game came out, and they were advertising the game. I think it's kind of, I don't think I could imagine another game dev really talk about, yeah, our game's about 40 hours of content, until you realize where everything is. Then once you do, it's like 3 hours to beat the game. It's just wild to me. And they weren't too far off. I mean, World Record only broke sub 2 not too long ago, so they were only off by an hour, 20 some odd years ahead of time. Again, I'm not saying it's padding. I'm wondering where the padding is specifically in Banjo Kazooie. If someone says there's padding, I'm just curious what examples they have, because I feel like there isn't much padding. The only padding I can think of is making it so that if you die, you have to recollect all your notes. That's the only padding I can think of. Guys, we found the secret to life. Cuboid shapes. It's about personality and stylization. That's pretty much the key to lasting design. Games that age very well is the designs that are stylized. They're not high resolution, high quality, realistic stuff, because that's going to look dated. But yes, no, you're not wrong, freakers. That pretty much is the secret to video gaming life. Cuboid shapes, personality. Collecting notes, it's probably limited to what they could store as well. Possibly. No, I don't think so, because when they enter into levels, I mean, they can go into loading zones when they collect. I don't see it. Maybe if when they enter and exit and then re-enter a level, I could see them being a reason why they have to reset the note count, because then it would be like, what if they go into the next level or the next level and they collect 20 notes from every level, then they have to store that memory. I could believe that. But when it comes to dying, you lose your note count as well. So that was definitely a conscious choice and not necessarily a limit on the hardware. But that's the only example of padding I can think of in the Banjo games. Sorry, in the original Banjo Kazooie game. But so they finally created Banjo in a way that they really liked the aesthetic for him, and they decided to build the rest of the game around that. So going into the world design, the rest of the levels, because again of Banjo's design and the vehicle building mechanic, they decided to make the levels as if they were more hand created. So for some examples, in Showdown Town, all the houses look really ramshack, and the houses have really uneven doorways, and there's giant sheets of pieces of sheet metal nailed to the sides of the walls. Nutty Acres has, it's a tall level with clouds, but instead of just being clouds that float around, there are these giant set pieces where there's a bunch of clockwork mechanisms going around the level and carrying them around. They have giant screens along the outside of everything to make this artificial look for a skyline and everything like that. In Logbox 720, they have computer parts located all over the place, but they look more like common objects, as if they were created by someone who isn't really knowledgeable on computer parts. Like they have for the graphics card, it's just a stack of crayons looking standing upwards, or the CPU is just a giant brain. Banjoland has random pieces of metal on the giant test your strength machine that they built. That's a recreation of the Banjo Tooie one. On the back of it, they have these huge pieces of sheet metal just randomly scattered along the back of it to hold the whole thing together. They have the center columns, the support columns in the middle, all throughout the level. As you look up, parts of it don't have the brickwork along the outside of it, almost looking like an attempt where people were working really quick and really hard to try to just throw whatever they could together to get the final product in time for the game. The Jigoseum has on the surface, there's these rips all over the place of the metal on the ground that shows the wireframe base underneath them. In the Terrarium of Terror, they have all of the leaves and all the plants, which is pretty much the entire level. They look like they're hand stitched together from fabric. You can see the stitching marks between all of them. So they went with this handmade, these people kind of like pitched in together to make like big play sets, or playsets is not the right word, but the set pieces for what you would see like a play on a stage. And then they have Spiral Mountain at the end, which is a really stark contrast to the rest of them, because all these levels were created in time really quickly for Banjo to play through the game, whereas Spiral Mountain is something that's always existed. It was originally a game that was the original Banjo game was a game that was supposed to be created, handcrafted, and made really nicely. They took their time, so that's why Spiral Mountain has this full, complete, cohesive aesthetic all around. It's very naturally occurring, as opposed to all the Showdown, the Banjo Kazooie nuts and bolts levels, which are thrown together really quickly. So Spiral Mountain, as a direct contrast, looks nothing like those levels, because the direction they went with for the art style had completely different motivations. I thought that was a really neat touch when you look at the two of them side by side. Probably just coded dying as re-entering the level. That's possible. I don't know. I feel like that could have been a time saver, but I think I don't know. I guess we don't know the final result. I could probably shoot a message and see if one of them. I feel like the devs who worked on the Banjo games are very open about this stuff, so it would be interesting to ask if they had Banjo dying for ending with the end result of resetting the notes in the level. Was that an active choice to try to make the gameplay last a little bit longer for first-time players, or was it a limitation of hardware by the N64? I'm curious now. So we've talked about the levels and the aesthetic. So we'll talk about some of the new characters that they add into the game. So the biggest, most important new character they added would be the Lord of Games. He is referred to, Lord of Games is referred to as Log, and I will refer to him as that from now on. And he's one of the few new characters in the game who the fourth wall just does not exist with his character. He is the orchestrator of the entire, like, the game itself, Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, because he is, being the Lord of Games, he is someone who has created all video games. And this, they kind of lean into this a little bit more with this design, which is he's basically a floating computer monitor head, where on his face it displays Pong, where the two paddles going on each side are his eyes, and the ball that goes back and forth is supposed to represent his nose or his mouth. And he's the one who creates the whole Banjo game, and he pits Banjo and Grunty against each other, but he's not an antagonist. He's not an angry force against the two of them. He's very much a neutral force. He's just very tired of Banjo, Kazooie, and Grunty going back and forth with each other, and so he creates Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, meant to be a final test and a final battle between the three, where it's supposed to be the final resolution, where whoever wins owns the rights to Spiral Mountain and their game, whereas the loser will end up having to work in Log's factory for all of time. So that's his inclusion and involvement in the game. They also had, like we discussed briefly before, the townspeople. They are meant there to populate Showdown Town, populate the central hub to make the world seem much more alive. But they are also, the fourth wall does not exist for them. They are very much aware of the fact they exist in a video game, and most of everything in this game is aware of the fact that they are themselves in a video game. When you talk to them, they will make references specifically to the fact that they are in a video game. They will reference the fact, if you hit them, that they are supporting cast characters and things like that. Unfortunately, they are meant to just be kind of something that fills space, that makes the town feel more alive. As I said before, it's kind of disappointing that they didn't give them more of a role in the game, because I think there was a lot of opportunities with that, but they decided to put most of that of the world building and the character building into the NPCs and the more known characters from the previous Banjo games, and the couple new ones they introduce. But that's most of the new characters, so we'll talk about some of the old, returning, pre-existing characters from the previous Banjo games. So characters they brought back include Grunty, obviously he's the main antagonist. They brought back Mumbo Jumbo, they brought Humba Wumba, they brought Bottles. His cousin Jam Jars is missing, unfortunately, from the game. They don't bring back Tootie either to keep going, just like they didn't bring her back in Tooie. The only reference to her was a Easter egg to the fact that she is missing and not mentioned. They brought Jolly Roger. They brought in Captain Blubber. The Jinjos and Minjos come back again, and they also brought back Mr. Fit from Banjo Tooie. So something really interesting about how they designed the game and how they chose to include these characters. And as I was talking before, most of the characters are knowledgeable and aware of the fact that they exist in a video game. And the way that they bring back the characters kind of further cements the idea and reinforces that they are aware that they are in a video game. Because when they bring back the characters, they don't take them and shoehorn them into roles that is familiar or similar to what they did in previous games for the sake of doing so in familiarity, but because that would be at the expense of the game overall. They decided to incorporate the characters because they would fit a role, and it doesn't matter what they did in previous games. And so, for example, they have some very different roles that they filled. So Humba Wumba in the previous game, her job exclusively was to cast magic and turn Banjo Kazooie and transform them into something else. And in the new game, she becomes a character who sells blueprints and sells parts to Banjo. Mumbo in the previous game, first game was the transformation part, but eventually then became someone who goes around casting magic and interacting with the world. He now simply becomes the individual who owns the garage, which is the location at which you create your vehicles. And Boggy goes from being the most hated character in the Banjo franchise, the most despised, despicable human being who is a horrible father, who spends no time, who's a drunk and an alcoholic, and he ends up becoming someone who still does not spend any time with his family. But this time, instead of being a drunk alcoholic who is very sad and very physically unfit, he becomes someone who owns a gym, and you go and spend the notes you spend money to upgrade Banjo's character. So they are very different repurposes of the characters, but they are very much aware of it and acknowledge it. and almost are tongue-in-cheek about it. But there are some characters who are brought over from the previous games into Nuts and Bolts, and they fill similar types of roles. So we have the Jinjos, and their new job is to give objectives instead of just to be found. However, they are hidden by default. You can get a piece that makes it so it is easier to find them and search for them, but as a whole, they are still by default hidden throughout the level, and you need to try to find them. Minjos are brought back. They are meant to be something that imitates the Jinjos and looks similar to them. However, they are not aggressive attackers like they were in the previous one. They weren't meant to be something that was not something to try to bait you. If anything, they try to stay hidden. And then they bring back Mr. Fit, who in the previous game in Banjo Tooie, he was someone who gave you a Jiggy after you completed fits of fitness or different kind of like a triathlon type of objective. And when he comes into Nuts and Bolts, pretty much all of the objectives and missions that he gives you are tied to in some way exercise or fitness or sports or speed. So they are definitely some similar, but some of them very different. And something as an extra note I just want to talk about while we're on the topic of characters, it makes so much sense, and I feel like an idiot for not realizing earlier why they brought back the certain choices of characters that they did, but out of all the bosses and other characters they brought back, why they brought back Mr. Patches seems so out of place, because he was a random boss that you fought in one level in Banjo Tooie. He's literally a character who's a flying bunch of patches in a game that's all about, the entire aesthetic is about handmade stitchy patchwork all over the place. God, I feel like an idiot for not realizing that sooner. They probably realized his aesthetic matched the world of Banjo, Nuts and Bolts so much, like, oh, we got to find a way to bring him back. So I thought that was kind of funny, something I didn't realize originally. Hey, what's up, Kappa Cow? And what's up, The Real? How are you doing? All right. So that is the things that I noticed about that I thought was worth talking about when it comes to the art style or the characters or the changes they made with the characters. The next thing we're going to talk about is the biggest thing, the most important thing, which is the actual vehicles that they did in the game, the approach to vehicles, the deviation from platforming and putting more emphasis on the player creation aspect. Yeah, and then they remade him metal for another fight, which was also interesting. Yeah, the next thing we will talk about will be the vehicles themselves. And I'm going to take a short break because I've been talking for an hour and a half nonstop. And I want to give myself just a short break. I'm going to try and make myself some tea. If you need to go to the bathroom, if you need to get a snack, now will be the time to do it. We're going to take a short break, 5, maybe 10 minutes. We'll be back briefly. Hello. I have returned. And I have brought tea. Delicious tea. Probably really fucking hot and I can't touch it. Yeah, that's definitely pretty hot. I'm gonna wait a little bit. Okay. So let's see. Yes, that's right. Vehicles. That's what we were talking about. Oops. So with this game, vehicles is the huge thing. This is the main part of the game. This is the make or break. This is the primary gameplay loop for Banjo Nuts and Bolts. So if you don't know what a primary gameplay loop is, a primary gameplay loop is the idea or mechanic that your entire game is built or based around. Most things that you incorporate into a game should add to or build or flip it on its head or tweak whatever this primary gameplay mechanic is. So for example, in the main series Mario games, like Super Mario 64 or the original 1985 Super Mario Brothers, the primary game mechanic, the primary gameplay loop is jumping. So, you have Mario who does his jumping. He has the wing cap, which is an addition that makes it so the jumping leads into flying. It makes it so they have the metal cap, it makes it so you're invincible, but it also makes it harder to control yourself when jumping because you sink a little bit faster. They have in the original Mario Brothers game, they have it so you get the mushroom, which makes it so that you actually cannot maybe jump through certain things, or you can break blocks and things like that. It's all around jumping. In Halo 1, the primary gameplay loop is the shooting or the gunplay. So you have all these different weapons that you have access to that make it so you can approach these situations with gunplay in different ways. They have the overshield, so you can run in guns blazing, and you have basically extra health. You have the not the overshield. You have the cloaking that makes it so you can sneak up behind enemies. for to do approach gunplay in a different way. They have all the different vehicles that have different weapons on them and stuff like that. Pokemon Snap, the primary gameplay mechanic, the primary gameplay loop. I keep saying mechanic instead of loop. The primary gameplay loop of Pokemon Snap is taking pictures. So you have the fruit, where the apples, where you can lead Pokemon to interact with other Pokemon or with other parts of the environment. You have the Pester Ball to make them react in a certain way, so you can take pictures of them in different ways. You have the Flute, so then they can behave in different ways and take pictures of them that way. You can speed up or stop to make sure you can be there at the perfect time for a specific picture, things like that. Danganronpa has the Clash Trials as the primary gameplay loop, so all the times that you're talking to the characters and getting background information might make it so you are more prone or less likely to accuse them of certain crimes based on going around and gathering evidence. These become different truth bullets that you can use in the Clash Trial to progress it or approach it differently and things like that. So the primary gameplay loop is the main important mechanic in the game that most other mechanics will tie to, enhance, flip it on its head, or change it or tweak it in some way. So the vehicles in Banjo Nuts and Bolts are the primary gameplay loop. The way that they approach missions or objectives in this game is a direct contrast to how they do in Banjo Kazooie and Banjo Tooie, and it's a really interesting choice where they decided to do something so polar opposite to the previous two games. So in Banjo Kazooie and Banjo Tooie, games would give Banjo unique upgrades that had very specific and limited effects on Banjo or the world around them. And then in order to complete a challenge, you would have to figure out, with the tools at your disposal, with the abilities, the attacks, the upgrades that you have, it's up to you to figure out how you're supposed to use those to solve the puzzle and then successfully executing on it. So it's figuring out how the developers created the puzzle, how it's supposed to be solved, and then the players successfully figuring out a way to then pull it off successfully. It's not just about figuring it out, it's about being able to then follow through and be able to do it. All the objectives that Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts gives you are meant to be completed with vehicles. And there's two different types of way that they approach the vehicle usage. You either have player's choice, which is they give you a set of objectives with certain restrictions, and then they say, okay, player, you go build a vehicle that can complete this. Or they have ones that are called logs choices, which are missions that you need to go and complete. However, you cannot build your own vehicle. You are given a predetermined, pre-made vehicle, and you are required to complete that one. The first two Banjo games, the way that they set up their mission structure is they're basically made to have curated solutions. So the design of the game makes it so the objectives are more linear and specific to allow for exploration through trial and error to find something that works, but the end solution to most of the problems can only be solved in one or two different ways performed a very specific manner. This design, when games go for this design, it allows for the player to feel smart when they do manage to successfully figure out how to solve the problem, and even more so when they manage to figure it out very quickly. But the issue with this is if anything about the explanation is obtuse, if there's any kind of inconsistencies with the mechanics or the abilities that the player has at hand, it can seem very frustrating and unfair, and then the player becomes forced to essentially brute force something. The next game we will be playing is Yooka Laylee, but that is one of the issues that Yooka Laylee has, is there are different types of glass that the character is meant to break, and they all look like the same glass. However, they are supposed to be broken in a very specific, different way from each other. No, certain moves that are even descripted as saying they break glass don't successfully work at breaking the glass. And that can be very frustrating when there's inherent inconsistencies, that it works for one other time, but it doesn't work for this time. And that is one of those things, one of those pitfalls that can occur when it comes to curated solutions, like the first two Banjo games have. Banjo Nuts and Bolts, instead of having curated solutions, are user-generated solutions. So what this does is the design of the game allows for exploration and trial and error. However, the solutions can be limitless, or near limitless. These designs allow the players to flex their creative muscles, and it can make them feel amazing when they manage to create a perfect device or a perfect vehicle that can solve the issue, solve the objective, but even more so when they can think of it almost instantly, put it together, and it works first try. It can feel fantastic. The other huge benefit to this is if they can figure out something that cheeses the objective, basically solves it in a way that the devs did not oversee and clearly wasn't something foreseen ahead of time, it can actually make the players feel like they're even smarter than the devs, which is one of the best feelings. One of the examples of this. One example of this is in the Jigozeum. There is a mission where it's a log's choice, so you're given a preset vehicle where you're supposed to take it, and it skims across the water, and it reaches to the other side of the level where there is a box, where when you open the box, it has wheels in it. You take the wheels, you reattach it to your vehicle. Then you get back in the water, scoot across to the other side, and then you go up a ramp, go across a narrow little bridge, and then you get to the end of the level and complete it. You have to do that within a certain time limit. However, that is clearly the intended objective, the intended way that was meant to be solved for this, because the logs vehicles tend to be more curated solutions. They still are a little bit open-ended more often than not, but they tend to be more curated solutions. The thing is, when you go into the mission, you immediately start it, you can actually get out of your vehicle, edit the vehicle, and take it so the little propellers spin in on the back that propel the vehicle forward through the water. You can take them and you can actually place them on top of the vehicle, hop back in the vehicle, and it now acts as a helicopter that goes directly upwards, and you can fly right into the end goal at the end. An example of something cheese, and I guarantee the individual who figured out that solution probably felt like $1 million being able to realize that this was something that the devs had not foreseen, and they were able to outsmart them and create their own solution that made things so much easier. So there are huge upsides to user created solutions. The downsides is it kind of excommunicates or walls out certain types of players, because I do believe that every human is creative in a certain way, but they might not be creative when it comes to problem solution. They might not be a creative individual when it comes to video games. And if you're not a creative individual, it definitely is something that can be kind of frustrating to try to think of a vehicle that can work for a very specific set of circumstances or restrictions. And it could also be seen as lazy game design, where they go and they create okay, here's a couple of, obstructions in the way. We'll put an arbitrary time limit on here. But yeah, you go create the vehicle. You go create the fun that you have. It can definitely be seen as something that's a little bit more lazy when it's more on the player's shoulders to try to create the fun that they have with the games. But they are very, very different from each other. Very ballsy thing to do with something, a very established formula that people really like to do what's essentially the polar opposite to it. Hi, Booper. So going on to the mission structure of the missions. It's the same case with Scribblenauts. So much freedom, and I ended up solving every problem with the wings of the gun. So it's actually really funny that you say that, because... Hold on, I need some tea. So it's really funny you say that. Usually, as of right now, when I have some free time, I usually will just binge watch a bunch of zero punctuation videos. It's a gentleman named Yahtzee who lives now in the US, but he lived in Australia, and he is a game critic and reviewer. And he's a very eloquent way with words. And I happened to come across the one with the video he talks about one of the Scribblenauts games. And he said that it was kind of a fun idea, but once he realized that, you could spawn in Cthulhu. It was really funny the first couple times that you can spawn in this eldritch monster, but once you realize that anytime you go into a mission that has any kind of baddies in the way, you spawn Cthulhu, and that part of the equation is completely gone. It doesn't matter anymore. Most solutions, you could spawn in a helicopter and a rope and carry whatever objective it is that you need to get to the location. At that point, it just becomes a matter of, are the rope physics going to work with you? And so when you have these open-ended solutions like this, it can be really fun, but it can also it can get boring very quickly. Some people just aren't creative. They end up defaulting to the same thing over and over, and the games can feel boring because it feels like it's the same thing over and over, because they found something that generally works, and they don't want to try anything outside the box, because again, They just might not be a creative person when it comes to that when it comes to building, when it comes to video games or problem solving. So there are definitely big drawbacks to that. It's the paralyzation of choice, I think it is. I can't think of the right word for that, but basically, you know, if you have a choice between 5 things, it's a lot easier to choose than if you have a choice of 100 things. More isn't necessarily better for everyone, because when they have so many choices, they can get paralyzed because they don't know which of the so many options that they want to go with. Same thing with Banjo, because you have so many choices of different parts to combine, or so many different types of builds or ideas that you want to go with. It can be really difficult to decide how it is that you want to proceed. So, going on to the mission structure with the vehicles, when a player is given a mission, they're given some certain tidbits of information. So they're told what kind of mission is. If it's a race mission, if it's a delivery mission, if it's a retrieval mission, if it's a use of force mission, if it's a limited control mission, if it's an offensive or destructive type of mission, or maybe a defensive type / protection type based mission. They're also told where it's located, if it's on land, if it's in the air, if it's on the water, if it's underwater, or if it's some combination of those. You know, it could be multiple of them at once throughout the entire mission. Then the location, is it a wide open area? Is it a narrow and restricted location? Is it the entire map? Is it a small cutoff section of the map? And then they're told what kind of obstacles they have. If there are enemies there, if there's very uneven terrain, so you need to build the vehicle in a certain way. If there are out of bounds locations, you need to stay in a certain kind of perimeter that if you leave there, you instantly fail the area, things like that. So once you're given what kind of mission it is, where it's located, and the obstacles you need to deal with, the player then takes this information and they need to try to create a vehicle that will then fulfill those requirements and get to the end of the mission with a success. But it's not just about building a vehicle that will do the bare minimum. It's also about building something that can exceed and do it efficient enough to get all rewards. So upon what kind of mission is, where it's located, in the obstacles, there's also how it's tracked, or how the progression is tracked. It could be a score-based one. There's one we have to shoot soccer balls into a goal, so you need to score X amount of points within the time limit given. They have some are time-based, where it's a race, or you need to carry something to a certain location quick enough without losing the object or breaking it. They have some that are health-based. There are ones where you need to protect something from oncoming attack forces, and you need to defend it from the attack forces, or maybe you need to destroy something else before they destroy something of yours, so you need to beat it quickly enough while also defending your thing and leaving it with a certain amount of health. So there's lots of different measurements in terms of how successful you are with the missions, and it becomes not just creating a vehicle that can successfully beat the missions, but then also on top of that do it efficiently enough. The safety cube, the classic safety cube. I had a mission where there's a character who goes on a jog through a route, and he jogs, enemies spawn into the area, and you need to try to kill the enemies before they do a certain amount of damage to him. He has a health bar. When he gets to the end of it, depending on how much of his health is left, you get, the one of 3 different rewards. And we made because of the creativity of the game and the limitless options, we created a giant floating cube, a big metal box around him, so it would fly overhead. And whenever he stopped to take a breather, we would drop down on top of him, lock around him to protect him from all outcoming forces, and have our heat-seeking missiles come out of our vehicle and attack any enemies in the area. It was very fun. But I guarantee there's so many different ways in which other people have approached that mission. But that's how I thought of it. But that's the beauty of the game, is that I was able to think of something so outlandish and so different, and it worked. We managed to complete it and get it with almost him taking no damage. But with all these different qualifications that the game gives, or rule sets for what the mission is, besides there is a limit on how many parts you can have for a vehicle. It is a very, very large number. I have reached it a couple times, but it is a very large number, and at that point it really just becomes your imagination is the limit. There really is very few limits. There are so many different parts. There's so many different pieces that have so many different actions and different mechanics, and it becomes up to the player to figure out how they're going to solve these issues, and it comes down to the creativity of the individual. But also on top of it, there's a small handful of about 15 or 20 different things, like the things I said. If it's a racing mission, if it's a delivery mission, a limited control, a destruction based one, whether it's one that's on air, one that's on the water, whether it's a combination of those, if it's the full map, if it's a small location, if there's lots of enemies, if there's uneven terrain, all these different factors can be mixed and matched and combined into different ways so that it allows for a near limitless amount of different types of missions, when you also factor in the different maps themselves, which have different terrain and different other factors that they can exclusively mix into them based on the aesthetic or the theming of them. They can throw in more. But it allows for again, also near limitless number of combination of missions. But the also other important thing is this allows for scaling of difficulty. They can just make it so it's a mission that's just on land, where you just drive a vehicle and you're carrying something, which is one of the very first things you do in the game. It's much more natural, I think, for an individual to figure out how to build a car because they, are more familiar with cars. And then as time goes on, they can scale it up and make it so that, now you have to build a plane that carries something. So it's like, okay, it's a little more foreign of a thing, where you're now creating a vehicle that can fly, and you're still carrying something, but maybe this thing that you're carrying can break or take damage, so you got to make sure not to drop it and be more careful. And so they can ramp it up as time goes on to make things a little bit more difficult, on top of making sure that things stay fresh by keeping just a couple, a set group of reoccurring factors. But the way that they mix and match it can both scale the difficulty, but also keep it feel fresh and creative. And of course, force the player to think outside the box and create different vehicles for these solutions on top of it. So, we talked about quite a bit about Banjo Nuts and Bolts. We talked about the characters, we talked about the vehicles, we talked about the aesthetics, we talked about the art design, we talked about how they approach levels. So now, let's talk about how it itself was groundbreaking. So definitely, I think the thing that stands out about this game is the player creation and the content, and also the tools. This is not the first game that has existed where it had a lot of emphasis and focus on player created content. They had The Sims exist in 2000. Even SimCity existed back as far as 1989, where, the SimCity, you are creating an entire town. You're creating an entire town and trying to evolve it and expand it. The Sims, you are creating a family and you're creating the house and furnishing it and creating it for them and everything like that. But a lot of these early example of games that had a huge emphasis on creation aspects, they were more about construction and management sims. Simulations are very different compared to the type of game that we got with Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. The thing with SimCity or The Sims is that they are types of games that the objectives or the obstacles you have to overcome are generally random generated, and something that you can kind of prepare for and expect. You can expect through just drawing from your real life, you can kind of expect certain things to know obstacles you can come across in The Sims, like setting up a fireplace right next to your bookcase. Might lead to a fire because you can put two and two together that bookcases are made of wood and they're flammable. And it could be an objective that you never encounter, or it could be an obstacle you never encounter because you are aware of that ahead of time. Banjo Nuts and Bolts is different because it is players creating something that is used to overcome curated content. I think I had a lot of trouble trying to figure out specifically what it was about Banjo Nuts and Bolts that was unique and groundbreaking for how it approached player created content. It's definitely there, and I think the closest thing I can think of is Banjo Nuts and Bolts is one of the first games to have your main tools that you use to overcome obstacles is created by you, and the obstacles you overcome are custom created curated content that you'll experience over and over again. Like the one we have to jump off the ramp. Yes, we made some very interesting vehicles. The only game that I could think of that is comparable, funny, I was just about to say that, Mandy. The only game that I could think of that is comparable to Nuts and Bolts in that aspect is The Incredible Machine. The Incredible Machine was a game that came out in 1993 on PC, and basically you have to create these Rube Goldberg machines to complete very simple objectives. It's usually get a bowling ball into a little cup at the end, or pop a balloon. But the means at which you do it, they give you these different tools, and you are supposed to create these little these Rube Goldberg machines where everything interacts with each other, and in the end you complete the curated desired result. The main difference between that, though, is that with Banjo Nuts and Bolts, you are constantly gathering more and more resources. You are gathering more parts. You are gathering different pieces to your vehicle that allow for completely new, unique interactions. So with Banjo Nuts and Bolts, you have the typical, the normal body outline pieces. You have the engine, you have the fuel. But then as time goes on, you have guns, that shoot eggs, and then they upgrade to ones that can shoot grenade eggs. You have different propellers that could either be there permanently, or they activate and deactivate. So then you can make them so it goes from being a vehicle that's just a vehicle, a car, to then becoming something that is a helicopter. Then you have more unique ones where you have a detacher, where once you press the button, you can separate and detach an entire part of your vehicle and leave it behind. You have a giant sticky ball that when you drop it down, it has sticky properties, so whatever it touches, it then drags and carries with it. There is a spring that you can use as your vehicle to give it essentially a jump to get over certain obstacles, or you can put it on the front-facing part of the vehicle and use it to shove other things back. As time goes on, you get more and more of these different parts that can function and work well in different places. The Incredible Machine, just like their curated levels with what you need to do for the goal, it's curated in what they give you access to. Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, your limit is how many pieces you can use, which is extremely high. But when you get access to a new part, you permanently have access to it, and you can use it for any objective that you come across. With the Incredible Machine, they will give you access to 4 parts, and then in the next level, it is completely separate from those previous 4 parts that you got. And maybe 3 missions down the line, you'll get access to one of those parts that you had in that other mission. It's curated objectives and obstacles, but the tools they give you to create it are also very curated as well. The solutions are, I would say, possibly limitless, but not. I still think that's not quite true. So the closest example I can think of to a game like Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts would be The Incredible Machine, but it's a much, much, much more limited scale, and that's obviously to be expected considering we're comparing a game that came out in 2008 to a game that came out in 1993, especially since The Incredible Machine is just a simple 2D game. But as far as I can tell, Banjo Nuts and Bolts was very, very unique with taking a game where it's user-created content, where the user-created content is the tools that you use to complete curated objectives in a full 3D space. And one that isn't limited so much on the tools that you have access to. Closest to it now, but back then it was pretty unique. Damn, everyone brought up Besieged 2, and I completely forgot about it. When did Besieged come out? Besieged came out in 2015, that's why. That was 7 years afterwards. Yeah, Besieged came out 7 years afterwards, that's why. Yeah, I was looking for games that came out beforehand, but yes, Besieged is very similar in that aspect. No, go for it, Andy. I'm glad. Yeah, no, but the Incredible Machine still has it's had a lot of different kind of slight tweaks and changes and additions to it, but nothing to the extent that we have with Banjo Nuts and Bolts. Is 2 free? Yeah. So actually, the next thing we're going to be talking about why this game was so groundbreaking is the player creation interface was huge. There were other games, obviously, that we talked about this before. There were other games that existed that had player creation types of content. We had, Tony Hawk Pro Skater has its own thing where you can build different levels, and that's a 3D game. Actually, I think it was the first one was 2003. When did that come out? that was a lot older. Okay. So we had Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3, which had a level builder that was in a full 3D space, but it was a lot more limited in the choices of options of things you could use. We did have Little Big Planet, which was also a game that had a lot of user-generated content. That was 2.5D. I'm trying to think what else. I mean, we have Minecraft, which was also in 3D, but the Minecraft's entire game was built around the user generation content, whereas Banjo Nuts and Bolts was a large part about it. It was the user. It was the interface to create these objects led to the content that explored afterwards. And a lot of the previous games that had these user interfaces, while they were partially 3D, they weren't to the extent that they did for Banjo Nuts and Bolts. Like we said, Little Big Planet did have a bit of a 3D aspect, but the 3D, the depth perception part to it, was mostly focused on the aesthetics of it, not so much the gameplay elements. Still existed, but Banjo's creation in the 3D was extremely important. And so creating this user interface was extremely important, and was actually one of the hardest parts the devs said they had when creating the game, was creating an interface, a tool that allowed players to build their vehicles in a simple way that was quick and efficient, but also gave the player lots of control. And went through tons of different iterations. It took them quite a while, and I'm sure that was probably a basis for Besiege. I haven't played it myself, but Banjo's interface was probably, if anything, maybe a little bit too simple. But the idea of creating a full 3D interface to create full 3D tools to use in your game is not something easily done, especially on console. Oh my god, Melly. So the other thing about Banjo Nuts and Bolts that was pretty groundbreaking, it wasn't the first one, it wasn't the only one, and again, I want to repeat this, that when it comes to the discussion of these things, while Banjo was on the Xbox 360, and so it is starting to be the converging point between console and PC, so there is more comparisons. This still was relatively early, so I still think it is worth knowing that, especially on console, it was one of the earlier examples of games where a lot of the focus was on sharing content among other players. Little Big Planet, it definitely is more of an emphasis on this, because one of the biggest things and the longest lasting parts about Banjo Nuts and or Little Big Planet was the sharing of levels amongst other people. But Banjo's Nuts and Bolts emphasis on sharing blueprints among friends online was a huge thing, and they also had an entire, on their website, a page dedicated to sharing blueprints and helping to create other vehicles on there. So while it seems like it's just a natural part of gaming nowadays, whenever there's any kind of user-created content, 99% of the time they will have some kind of sharing aspect with other people. Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts was definitely one of the early examples on console where games are shared with other people. So here's the thing, Ninja, like, I kind of have the idea of taking these games and almost turning them having these discussions and kind of turning them into podcasts. I think that's the best way to listen to these. I have on my YouTube, I have a playlist for this is discussion number 4. I have the other discussions on YouTube, and they are definitely, I think the best way to describe them would be some kind of podcast that you put on in the background while you're getting other things done, while we discuss the histories of these different games, the developments, and the impact they had on the industry, and the lessons we can learn. Those perpetually in alpha games, is that what it felt like? Yeah, when it comes to games, especially ones that are about user content and how you interact with those games, those UIs, making sure they feel clean and polished and professional and not like they're in a beta stage can be a huge impact. Well, I think a reason why a lot of games are in alpha is because a lot of them are coming out in early access, and because they're releasing the game in early access, they're trying to work on the normal development of the game. But obviously the point of early access is to get feedback from players. So it's a mix between spending time trying to progress the game, but it's also a mix on trying to listen to the feedback on players and improve the game. So the development gets slowed down drastically because they're splitting their focus between progressing the game, advancing it, and getting it to an end state, but also listen to feedback, fixing issues and tweaking some things that players want. And then when you do those things, when you do like changes and tweaks to what the players want, that could directly interfere with other ideas or future mechanics that they want to implement. Okay, so those are the things I think were very groundbreaking when it came to groundbreaking mechanics that Banjo Nuts and Bolts had. In terms of influential, I think it's definitely one of the early examples, like I said, of games that had user shared generated content. It was common for games to have some kind of level creator, but in terms of games where the main focus are the main lasting content that comes from games being user generated content, I feel like that number has gone up. I feel like games like, obviously, Mario Maker is the really popular one. Grand Theft Auto has online races. Their entire community is dedicated just to creating new race maps for that. Minecraft, their entire server's dedicated to that. Same thing with Terraria. Project Dreams was a game that came out recently where the entire thing, it's a full engine and game that allows people to essentially create full games, create the game, and share it online for other people to try and play for themselves. So, I'm sure to an extent there's certain games developers who have looked back at Banjo Kazooie to see what they did, what they created, how they approach things, and therefore how these new devs could approach making games where the main content is user generated content and content that can be shared with other people who play. What's your opinion on something like The Sims, sharing house designs, custom items? It is PC, I suppose. I did not know that the Sims had the ability to share that type of stuff. It's not a surprise, but again, when it comes to PC games are very different because games that are released on console up until recently really had a lot more of a stringent process and difficult process to get through to printing and full release. It costs a lot more money. It was, the distribution costs and everything. To release a game on console was a lot harder and a lot more expensive, so there is less games to go through. And there was also, therefore, less major games, or if a game was new or unique or offered something, I feel like it was more likely to kind of get attention or a known presence. Whereas PC, it was very easy for someone to just try something out and then release it online for other people to try somewhere. So when it comes to, I could reference a mechanic that happened in an N64 game, and I could say it's groundbreaking, the first one to ever do it, but someone would probably be like, there's actually this one really obscure PC game that came out like 9 years before that was downloaded by 10 people, but it technically did it first. It's like, well, when it comes to that, researching stuff that happened first on PC is extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult to try to find the origin of certain things on console alone. When you throw PC into the mix, it is a nightmare. So the fact that you say that The Sims had sharing makes complete sense, but since Sims was always on PC and always online, it's really not something where I think of like, where was the origin point or where was the first game that did this, because I would just assume most of them would have it, and it seems almost arbitrary to try to look for that. Like, for example, consoles sharing content is something that I would obviously think of, oh, this is on the Xbox 360, or this is the PlayStation 3. This is the generation where online connectivity really became a huge presence, and therefore it's something I can look for, and it's usually something that was a focus of the game design. Whereas PC, a lot of the stuff that console does, PC had access to. It was just a matter of how creative they were in thinking of the idea first. So when it comes to console stuff, it's a lot easier to track the progression of information, whereas it's a lot more difficult to track the progress of PC stuff. I know a few Patreon supported games, and those are just stuck in development hell, probably and definitely, because once the game is finished, people might stop supporting them. I was actually talking about this recently. That's one of the reasons why I think Yondir Dev that has had so much attention, because people went and recreated the game in about a week, and the dev got a ton of shit for it. And I think the reason why is because he intentionally would drag his feet with the production of the game, because he realized how much money he was getting monthly from supporters, and realized that once he released the full game, those monthly supporters would be gone, that he would make a nice chunk of change when the full game released, but in the grand scheme of things, he would not get nearly as much. So it's funny you bring that up, because I think that is a real possibility when it comes to game design. They want to leave it in this perpetual depending on the game, obviously, because not every game that's made on Steam and Early Access will be getting some form of like Patreon support. But a lot of games, I do think that is a valid concern that they're constantly not fully finishing and releasing the game because they don't have a motivation to finish the game because they're just going to get less income. Like drills? Wait, what? Fall Guys level creator would definitely save a long term. Yes, I think so as well. I think that Fall Guys is going to be good for quite a while, for a lot of different reasons. But yes, a level creator for Fall Guys would be fantastic. If they had like a Halo level, like a Halo Forge comparable, it would be amazing. To LBP? I don't know what LBP2 is. Fall Guys will have to move to live longer term because to me, the more I play it, less I like the things I like and the more I dislike the things I hate. That's just when it comes to like repetition of any game. Oh, Little Big Planet. So it's been absolutely bonkers. Got fairly deep into Little Big Planet 2's level creation. The community around all that stuff was great, and there was like no end to how deep you could go. Yeah, it's I watched some videos during my research about the level creation for Little Big Planet, and I'm very, very surprised the depth that they could go to, because I mean, my first introduction to level creation was Super Mario Maker 2, and being on a grid-based system, it seemed so much more simple. The fact that they had Little Big Planet 2 the way that they did, or Little Big Planet in general, was really surprising to see. Yeah, I agree, Melly. It's good too. Patreon's good for studios, not so much direct actual, not a specific one project. I don't like this background. This background's nice, but it drives me nuts that it has the black bars on the sides. Now it's going to drive you nuts because you're aware of it. Let's do... No, we just did that one forever. Let's do this one. Okay. All right, so we are finally done with discussing Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts, the final product. Now we could talk that now the game is finished. We could talk about the reception that this game had, and boy howdy did it have a reception. So again, we'll be talking about the reception to the game, and I think the best way to quantify this is not exactly accurate, but in terms of the discussion, it is definitely the best method is by looking at the Metacritic scores. Basically, if you don't know how Metacritic works, Metacritic basically takes major review scores and aggregates them. It takes them all and averages them out. And something that is important to consider, but not really important for this time. But if a reviewer either does not give a number score for the game, they don't give a score at all, or if they give a letter score, what Metacritic does is they look at these reviews and they try to give a generalized average number for it and throw that into the mix. Now, that is more important for recent times because reviewers of recent times have now started to either not give number scores or give scores that are just tied to numbers. But in earlier games, it was definitely a thing where most of the games were tied to specific numbers. And I think that counts for Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. I think most people were just giving regular number scores. So figured I'd get that out of the way, let you know. So the reviews for Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts were mostly positive from critics, a little bit mixed, but mostly positive. Whereas it was mostly negative to middling from players. So on Metacritic, Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts got a score of 79. Which means it just barely cracked the top 200 games for the year of 2008 in terms of review scores. So Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts got a 79, whereas Banjo Kazooie got a 92, and Banjo Tooie got a 90. So yeah, no, it was pretty high. Like I said, reviewers, like critics, professional critics and everything, professional critics, I say with air quotes, they generally enjoyed the game. They gave it a positive score, not as high as the original games, but they still enjoyed the game. Now, the user score is a different thing. User score got a 6.6. This is compared to Banjo Kazooie, which got a score of a 9.1, which clocks it in as number 92 highest user rated score of all time out of any generation, any year on for user scores on Metacritic. And then Banjo Tooie got an 8.8. So we had Banjo Kazooie at a 9.1, Banjo Tooie at an 8.8, and Banjo Nuts and Bolts at a 6.6. Definitely a bit of a drop down when it came to the user scores compared to the critic scores. I mean, they both received drops, but some stronger than others. So those are the critical scores. Let's talk about the public reception to the game. Basically, the best way to sum it up is longtime fans of the game were very disappointed. They were upset by its large departure from traditional gameplay mechanics where Banjo Kazooie was a typical platformer. You explore through the levels with a set number of objectives, and once you're done, you move on. And also, a lot of reason why why a lot of fans were upset is they felt that they were lied to by developers by what the game promised, which I felt was really interesting. And I had heard that from a couple different people, and I'd seen that online. So we're going to take a quick deviation real quick. I went and looked at the advertising timeline for Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. So they had the first announcement for Banjo Nuts and Bolts. Where did that source go? Uh-oh. Did my notes get hecked up? That's not good. Dang, I lost that source. Good thing I remember that info. Banjo Nuts and Bolts was first announced in 2006, I believe. It was first announced in 2006 at a Xbox convention in Barcelona, of all places. Really weird one. And they announced it by showing a trailer that has Banjo and Kazooie walking through a house that looks like it's drawn with blue pencil all over the place. And they're trying to get out, and once they do escape, it shows in the trailer them running out, and it shows a mountaintop that has a Jiggy, a mountaintop that has a musical note, and a mountaintop that has honeycombs. And then that was all they showed in it. So not a whole lot of information, but definitely a point towards the typical type of gameplay. No jumping, just running. It had their cuboid design. It had their finished final design in the game. So as we discussed earlier, the design of Banjo took place very early in development and coincided at the point where they agreed they were going to be going with the building design, because the cuboid shape with Banjo matched the idea of building vehicles. So at this point in September of 2006, they felt confident enough to announce the game, and they didn't show anything about the vehicles. So at this point, game was pretty much dead silent. We didn't really hear anything for quite some time. Then February 2008 rolls around. So we go from September 2006 to February 2008. And Rare confirms that there is a new Banjo being made, and they say it won't be a traditional platformer. So then they don't show anything. They just talk about it briefly. And then the following month, almost exactly a month, March of 2008, they have a new website go up. The Banjo Kazooie website goes up. And on the website, they show a Jiggy on there, but it's on blueprint paper. It shows mechanical gears all over the place. And it definitely leads into the blueprint, the design type of aspect. Again, not directly showing anything. They show the Jiggy, but they don't show any kind of gameplay. They don't lean into showing the vehicles too much. They don't show into any kind of changes or similarity to the previous game at all. So we have 2006, it's announced. February, they announced that there is another Banjo game coming out, but it won't be a traditional platformer. The next month, they have the website go up, which has the blueprint design, which also another thing to note, in that original trailer they show in 2006, the blueprint, the drawing of the world around Banjo looks almost identical to the type of drawing style that they have on blueprint schematics. So there was tiny little references, but clearly nothing outright that says it. So we go back to March, where they show they tease the website that has the blueprint info, and then we jump up to May 13th. And Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts is formally announced, and they show gameplay that has the main emphasis of driving. Important thing to know about this. So we have March, they show the website, and May, they have the title and they show the gameplay. Somewhere in between here, I could not find an official date, but some point in between this, they show some actual gameplay in a trailer that actually shows the driving carts. So sometime between March and May, they actually show gameplay that has Banjo driving around in a vehicle. And the reason why I can place this gameplay release in between these 2 points is because it says Banjo Kazooie, but it doesn't have the title of Nuts and Bolts yet, so the title is still in the works. But sometime between March and May, they actually do reveal actual gameplay that Banjo is a focus about driving in vehicles. And then July 14th, we have the E3 trailer, and then in November the game is released. So a lot of people felt that Microsoft had lied to them or had baited them about the release. And I can agree that between the game's announcement in 2006 and the complete dead period where nothing is advertised, talked about, or heard from at all up until 2008, that information was left out there where most people would assume it would be a traditional Banjo game. But when we get to February, the Rare directly says it's not going to be a traditional platforming game. March, they lean the following month, they lean more into the blueprint kind of design, and sometime shortly afterwards, they outright show gameplay. And then about up to as many as possibly 7 months afterwards, the game was finally released. So I don't know. I mean, maybe there is. I could definitely see the announcement of Banjo in 2006 and someone automatically assuming it is a Banjo game. And I guess they could feel like Microsoft and everyone lied to them for the 2 years of the year and a half of no information. But I personally think people were just disappointed, and I think they immediately latch onto the idea of that disappointment as being lied to. That's my opinion. That's what I can gather. I don't know if you guys agree or disagree. Like they did in the instance only works, and people are going to be happy and excited about the change you're hinting at. Probably. I think so. We'll talk about the Rare's response to the negative reception, but they were expecting it. So a lot of fans were upset with the game because they felt, it was a big departure from the previous games, and they felt lied to. The mixed reception from players was expected and actually welcome from the developers because it showed to them that the fans cared very much about the Banjo IP, that they had such strong emotions, but they felt that in the end, the overall opinion of the game would be positive. And that seems to be the case. As time has gone on, the opinions of the game have settled to be more in the positive. But it took nearly a decade to get to that point where the initial anger about the game was all anyone could see associated with the game. And it was only 10 years later when that strong emotion had worn off did people go, it was a good game. It was a good game, just a bad Banjo game. Like I said earlier, when you do play the game, the start sequence feels hugely insulting if you expected a Banjo game. You think you want this, but you don't tier. Yes and no. I think that Rare was aware that people, I mean, they clearly were aware that people would be upset about the final release of the game. And I think they tried to do a slow rollout of information and try to build up people's expectations properly, that this is not going to be a typical platformer, that things are going to be different. They're trying to taper people's expectations to be excited for a Banjo game, but don't expect the same thing. And then as time went on, they revealed more and more information. If they had just surprise dropped the game and just had that beginning dropped in, I think that would be insulting. I don't think for kids maybe who don't know, they don't follow advertising cycles, they don't know that stuff. Maybe they just played Banjo as a kid and then go to the store and see a Banjo game on the shelf, they get excited to play it. That could definitely be insulting. But in terms of advertising cycles, I think they did an adequate job of slowly releasing the information to let people know that things are going to be different. If you go in and didn't know, yes, but I think at this, it's difficult to discuss because I'm trying to look at it two different ways. Trying to look at it at the time of the release, and I think at the time of the release, I think they did a fair enough job of letting people know ahead of time. This was not a spontaneous surprise drop where the game just came out and, oh, by the way, it's vehicles. They let people know half a year in advance that it was going to be different, and that almost a year in advance it was going to be different, and then half a year in advance they showed gameplay that was going to be drastically different. That if up to that point, if you were someone who were following games and didn't know going in and purchasing it, I don't think that's Rare's fault. I think that's your fault for not preparing ahead of time. When it comes to modern day gaming and people who maybe grew up playing Banjo as a kid and then saw a new Banjo game, I could also see that being frustrating, but I also don't think that's necessarily at the fault of the developers because there's so much people have access to understanding at the time. I really don't think necessarily Rare is at fault or should be really criticized in terms of how they advertise the game or led up to it. And the tongue-in-cheek humor at the beginning of the game, I could see that being frustrated, but I think they gave enough time and enough advertising, enough knowledge and know-how ahead of time that people should expect something else. I think the "you think you want this" is an honest saying. What do you mean it's an honest saying? I didn't enjoy it. I played through it, and I just feel sad. I hope that maybe one day we can get a traditional Banjo-style game. Don't get me wrong. I would much prefer like the next Banjo game to be Banjo 3. I do love the original style game, and my love for Showdown Town definitely reflects that. That being said, I wouldn't really be too upset if we got a Banjo Nuts and Bolts 2. At the time, possibly. People definitely, I mean, it wasn't a ubiquitous age of all the information being out in the internet, so and people following E3. So yeah, I definitely think there's a possibility people weren't aware at the time, but I think Rare did an adequate job of getting that information out there and doing a roll of information instead of just shocking everyone at once with the change in design, and also not about hiding it until the very end or just a short time beforehand. But yeah, the reception was very negative upon release by players. As time has gone on, most people have relented and agreed that the game, in most cases, most people think that it is a good game, a bad Banjo game, is really where it's kind of settled at. So, looking at the sales, the game sold 140,000 copies by the end of the year. So since it was released in mid-November, it sold 140,000 copies in 6 weeks, being an Xbox exclusive. We do know for sure that it sold at least 400,000 within the first 9 months of release, because it reached platinum status on Xbox. In order to be a platinum game on Xbox, you need to sell at least 400,000 copies within the first 9 months of release. And according to VG Charts, it has sold 760,000 copies total. If we include sales of the Rare Replay, then that means it sold 1.54 million copies. For comparison, Banjo Kazooie has sold 3.65 million copies, and Banjo Tooie has sold just over 3 million copies. So it was definitely a drop down. They were all exclusives. I think it was just a huge departure. I think it was a mix of a huge departure of games where they were so different from the previous ones, it affected sales. I think the type of game that Banjo Nuts and Bolts specifically was, being a creative game around building vehicles, was such a unique concept. And around a time, as we saw, the games that were released were mostly focused on shooters. It was definitely the high rise of shooters around that point. So I think it was being an exclusive on Xbox, where the majority of people who purchased those games were buying shooters. It definitely was not helping it at all. So it definitely did not sell as well as the previous games. And I think also being Banjo Kazooie and Banjo Tooie on N64, where it had the type of people who were purchasing those consoles, it was a 3D platformer. That is what a lot of people were into on the N64. I think it was right up the alley, the installation base. So I think it was a combination of those things where Nuts and Bolts just didn't sell nearly as well. And then for the sequels, as of right now, Banjo Kazooie does not have any sequels in the works as far as we know. The only other thing is that Banjo made an appearance in Super Smash Bros. Ultimate as I think it was the 4th character in the DLC. But yeah, as of right now, we don't know what is going on with the Baron Bird. They still are owned by Rare, which is still owned by Microsoft. We shall see if something will happen in the future. There was rumors going around that Platonic Games was teaming up with Microsoft to create a new Banjo game. However, those have been debunked by Platonic officially. So as we know right now, Banjo is just nothing's going on with him at the moment, but we'll see. I think it's still possible something could happen, considering Phil Spencer is the head of Xbox, and he's been putting an emphasis on games, and they've been working to bring back older games. They brought back like Battletoads and stuff like that. So we shall see. I think it's possible, but we'll find out. And Fable coming back, that's right. as in what people say that they want is different from what people actually need. It's true. I mean, there's a whole thing where, you know, developers have to basically save the player from themselves because the players think they know what they want, but they don't actually know what they want because it sounds great in their head, but once stuff is put on paper, then they realize that it's actually not that great. And that's one of the difficult parts about being a game developer is basically you try something that what fans think they want and it ends up not being good. The players don't know that. So you have to deal with the kickback of saying, we told you what we wanted. Why can't you just give us what they wanted? And they did try it out and they tested it out in game, but it just ended up not being a good final result. So it's tough being a game dev. Oh, there's definitely examples of things that have worked out. People do know what they wanted, but for all we know, there could be there's plenty of examples out there where devs have tried to create and give the players what they wanted, but once it's actually tried, it just doesn't feel fun. But okay, so now we can move on to the final bit of information, the final part of our discussion, where we can talk about what can we learn from Banjo Kazooie nuts and bolts. What can the industry learn from Banjo Kazooie nuts and bolts? Oops. Do 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 do. Boop 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 boom. God, this music's so good. Grant, you're a god. All right. So, what can we learn from Banjo Nuts and Bolts? I think one of the most important things we can take away from this is reinforcement of what we learned from BioShock 2. Just because it is from a successful IP does not guarantee its success. Banjo Nuts and Bolts is from one of the most beloved N64 franchises, and it sold decently well, but not nearly as good compared to the previous ones. The public reception around it is very negative. Now at this point, like I said, people have relented. They usually write it off as a good game, just a bad Banjo game. That was a very steep hill to climb up and try to overcome. But just because you are creating a game in an IP does not mean it is going to be beloved. It is not going to be liked. It is not going to sell well. And handling a dormant IP can be very, very risky. Reviving an IP, reviving a series is totally fine and okay. Making a spin-off of a game or an IP or a series is totally fine as well. Reviving an IP as what's basically seen as a spin-off is usually not a good idea. This seems kind of obvious in hindsight. But what happens is if you take an IP that's been dead for a long time and you bring it back, but you do it as a spin-off, you do it as something very different, you have some major issues to overcome. The hardcore fans who really love the original game and basically been dying for a new entry, and your biggest supporters, they are going to be your free advertisers who are going to tell everyone about it. They're going to see this new one and cry foul when they see the end results being so different from the original game. So now you have these people who would eventually become your biggest advertisers, now become your biggest enemy as they go and they badmouth the game to others, telling them how awful it's going to be and how bad it's going to be and how much of a departure it is in a bad way. So now you have some people talking about it very loudly, and people who don't know about the IP, who are completely blissfully unaware to the game or its existence or the previous installments, they're going to get these bad first impressions and kind of have this negative association with the game and the IP itself. And so now you have new people who could have potentially purchased the game and gone into the new IP and been excited are pretty much scared away from purchasing the game. But then you also have the hardcore old players who would have been your biggest, most loyal fans are no longer taking part in it as well. So taking an IP that's been long dead and reviving it as something so drastically different from what people remember is almost a never a good idea. If you guys can think of any examples of games that have done this, where they have revived a game that had been long dormant and done something so different, but it ended up being successful, I would love to hear. So I should say a long dormant IP that when it went dormant was still successful. It wasn't a game that was, bled dry and made awful and stuff like that. So people got sick of it and they had to retire it as a result. But I'm talking about a game that was riding high, did good, and just disappeared. And then upon finally bringing it back, they tried something so different and managed to do good. Is there any examples of that? Was Metroid Prime considered a spin-off originally? No, it was just the first foray into full 3D. Yeah, Metroid Prime was, a new series in Metroid series, but it was still main series, and it was different, but that's because it was their first entry into 3D because the hardware could handle it, and they wanted to try to take a crack at it. So I would not, I don't think it was ever considered a spinoff. Just a new dimension. That Banjo was also on the Xbox version of Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing. Was it really? Can you post a link in Discord of like YouTube gameplay of it? Monster Hunter was doing well, but then they changed a lot in Monster Hunter World. I don't think it was long dormant, though. Yeah, no, it wasn't dead. I mean, games will take new directions all the time. They had Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild was drastically different from Skyward Sword. It was drastically different from the Zelda formula in general. But Zelda as a series was not long dead. Banjo had Banjo Tooie came out in 2000, and then there was an 8-year hiatus. And then when they finally came back, you know, Banjo Tooie was very widely loved and regarded as a great game, just like Banjo Kazooie was. But then they had 8 years of silence, of radio silence, where it disappeared. And when it finally did come back, people were excited, and there was such a drastic deviation, and it ended up being very poorly received by fans. Is there an example of a game that did the same thing, was very well received, very popular, just disappeared for, you know, almost a decade, and then when it came back, it was drastically different from the previous ones, but it was well received? StarCraft. I thought they were both RTSs. But anyway, going back to what the industry can learn from the game, how a game is advertised is extremely important, despite the fact that, I mean, we went over the timeline. I still think they did a fine job when it came to letting people be eased into the understanding that Banjo Nuts and Bolts was going to be different from Banjo Kazooie and Banjo Tooie. People were still very upset, and they felt led astray. That was a lasting impression a lot of people had. When it comes to doing a game that is going to be a spin-off, or a game that is going to be so different from a previous game in the series, it's really important to put emphasis in that advertising to let people know how different it's going to be. Peck, what's up? Thank you for the raid. How are you doing? We are almost done with our discussion with Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts. We've talked about the game itself, the development of the IP, the development of Nuts and Bolts, what the games were released around the time of Banjo Nuts and Bolts, so what the climate of gaming was and what consumers were looking for. We talked about the final product of Nuts and Bolts, what it did right, what it did wrong, the influence it had, what's long-lasting, and now we're on the final part, what the industry can learn from the release and the development of Banjo Nuts and Bolts. Yes, when it comes to advertising a game, if you are going to be taking a game and reinventing it and changing it so drastically, it is really important to make sure that is clearly communicated, because even though I think they did a pretty decent job of easing people into the information that Nuts and Bolts was so different, that is still a lasting memory about Nuts and Bolts, as they felt like they were led astray. The one thing that can also be learned from Nuts and Bolts in the positive aspect is that freedom of choices, when given just a little bit of guidance or limitation, lets creativity flourish. A lot of, we talked about this before, paralysis of choice. Why I have so much trouble saying that? But when it comes to certain games, certain creative games like, you know, Minecraft, again, I do know it has gotten better in current times, but originally with Minecraft, you know, it had so much choice, there's so much to do, and it kind of can feel overwhelming when approaching a brand new game about what you can do, what you have access to, that you kind of just freeze up and don't know what to do. Banjo Kazooie, Nuts and Bolts, the way they approach the objectives, the missions with, okay, we'll tell you it's taking place on this terrain, it's taking place, there are these enemies, and it is a race. There's enough restrictions, or there's enough guidelines where it can kind of be like, okay, so knowing what I have to do and what obstacles are in the way, I'm going to create this certain vehicle that will hopefully succeed in completing it. It really is a great job of of helping the creative juices flowing, because restrictions are a great tool to fuel creativity. For example, as a quick tangent, when it came to Crazy Taxi came out, they had the arrow above the top of the screen that had the ability to point towards your next marker where you needed to go. That mechanic in video games was trademarked, so no other video games were allowed to use that for about 15-20 years or so. And because of that, developers because they could not use that tool, they were forced to think of something else to help them to create a part of the user interface that helped guide the players towards things that they're going to do in the future, or what they need to do next as an objective. So, you know, you'd have things like the wispy trail, like you see in The Witcher, where it creates this almost ethereal, kind of looking like a trail of fireflies that leads you to the next objectives and stuff like that. If we had not had that limitation in video games where that trademark happened, where you're not allowed to use this arrow, if anyone was allowed to use that arrow, for all we know, games would have stuck with that and just defaulted to that, and we wouldn't have evolved further and had different gameplay mechanics and alternatives to helping us to progress through the game. So having restrictions and limitations, while can be very damaging, can also be it can really help the creative juices pumping. So Banjo Nuts and Bolts did a great job of that. And another thing to learn is that a good product doesn't exactly make people happy. A good game doesn't make people happy with the final product. Now that the dust is settled, most people agree that Banjo is a good game. Banjo Nuts and Bolts is a good game. It's not a good Banjo game, despite the fact the game was good. How it was packaged and how it was presented definitely influences people's opinions on the game, and they tend to think of Banjo Nuts and Bolts as a more negative game as a result. But I think that's pretty much it. I think that covers the discussion about Banjo Nuts and Bolts. You guys have anything else you want to bring to the table or discuss? Actually, you know, a bad example that follows this would be StarCraft 1 into StarCraft Ghost. Very different, and watched, not received well at all. It's almost not known. See, that's the thing. I feel like it's very common for that to happen, for a game to be rebooted or changed or brought back from, you know, an IP to be revived, but they try something different and almost always ends out wrong. I want to know if there's any examples of that ended up being good. And in the actual game, puzzle makes sense if you know blueprints in the game. Agreed. Absolutely, Clyde. Absolutely. There's definitely tidbits and you can see the connections to it, but it's not obvious. You would never be able to look at that original announcement for Banjo Nuts and Bolts and look at that trailer and go, oh, they're drawing with pencil that's blue. It looks like blueprints. And the blueprints, they're probably building stuff. Oh, this game's going to be focused on building. Like, clearly you're not going to draw that connection, but there is little tidbits that lead up to it that show that things are clearly different. I mean, art style is definitely something that's important. I'm sure people would have seen that introduction trailer where they see things so different as this drawn out paper location. Definitely draws some attention and makes people think about stuff, but it's clearly not obvious, and that's a huge thing. I think to successfully revive a series, some degree of fan service pandering is very important. I completely agree. That's why I'm going to actually ask that on Twitter. I really want to know if there is an example of that. If a game is coming back for the first time in a while, they have to draw those old fans back, those people who are excited, who played the original ones and are excited to take part in the new one. I think it's extremely important to make sure you have something for them to be excited for the game specifically, so that they can, again, people who are excited from the get-go because they played previous games in the series, those are your biggest fans, those are your biggest advertisers. They are the most important part that you should keep them happy to an extent, because the number one thing that sells more than anything else is recommendations from people you know. You can watch an ad, it can look pretty cool, but I think at this point most people know that things are framed in a certain way to look good. Then when it comes to E3 trailers, that most people know not to expect it to be exactly the same in the video game because it's embellished. I think the number one thing that is going to... I mean, even though game reviewers, it has been proven time and time again that they don't take payments or they don't take bribes to review games positively, there's still that public perception that they are being paid and influenced, so people don't trust critics and everything like that. I think the number one factor when it comes to get someone buying a game is recommendations from people that they know personally. So when it comes to a new game coming out or a new entry in a game in a series that has long been defunct or gone, making sure that those people who are excited from the get-go because they played the previous games, they are such an important vital role to make them happy, because they're the ones who are going to tell people about the game, and they are going to be the ones who initially get new people's foot in the doors. Anything purchased by Microsoft? Yes, they have made the Viva Pinata series, which is pretty good. I mean, a lot of people don't like the Kinect, but Kinect Sports worked pretty well, and it sold fantastic. They made the Sea of Thieves game, which has just been growing more and more popular. What else? Rare Replay did pretty good. I don't know how the Battletoads game is doing. It's actually funny you say that too, because the first couple of releases that Rare made for the N64 were not that great in terms of like sales and everything. Like Cameo was very, very well received. Didn't sell that great. Perfect Dark Zero was okay, but didn't sell all that fantastic. Oh no, that's right. Perfect Dark Zero was the one that was received as okay, but sold fantastic. And also really interesting, I found out that Perfect Dark Zero and Cameo were both launch titles for the Xbox 360. So the Xbox 360 had 2 rare launch titles, which is weird. But Perfect Dark Zero sold decently well. Viva Pinata sold decently well. I mean, Banjo Kazooie Nuts and Bolts sold decently well. I mean, they reached the platinum status. Sea of Thieves has been doing better. Connect Sports did good. Am I forgetting anything? Can't think of anything. But they had a lot of flops as well. Like Grab by the Ghoulies did not do good on Xbox. I think the future Viva Pinata games didn't do as good. Used to like keep the appetite running between major releases. Agreed. Conker's Bad Fur Day. That's right. They did do that. I don't know how that game sold at all. I don't know what the sales were like on that game. Hi, Aqua. Cameo released the 360 wanted to play. Yep. I heard it was very, very positively received. It just did not sell very well. I loved Perfect Dark Zero as well. Yeah, no. Sea of Thieves is their first big, huge success. No, second huge success because Connect Sports definitely sold well. Connect Sports sold very well. It was just a matter of how many people owned a Connect, but it sold very well compared to the install base especially. But even not relative to the install base, it still sold pretty well. Thank you. I appreciate it, Yoshi. And Fable, you had the Golden Trail that appeared. Yes, that's right. Thank you. I was thinking of Witcher was the first one, but that's right. Fable did that too. Battletoads to try and ride off both Souls and Retro Revival? Possibly. I think, Phil Spencer has been a big proponent when it comes to bringing back old games and giving them new installations. So I think he definitely pushed for Battletoads. I could see him. That's why I think it's possible we could get another Banjo game in the near future. Well, that's the thing, Divine. Connect Sports was for the Xbox 360, not for the Xbox One. Rayman kind of. Was Rayman a drastic departure from the previous installations in the series, though? Rayman did have a revitalization that didn't have anything for a while, but I imagine it looks pretty similar from what the old games were. Was Rayman 1? Oh, interesting. Interesting. I'll take a look at that. Can someone post on the Discord, remind me to look up the Rayman games? Okay. Cool. I mean, does anyone else have anything to discuss about the topic? Because I'm officially out of discussion material for Nuts and Bolts. I love the game. I think it's great. I would much prefer a Banjo 3 in the future, but if we got a Banjo Nuts and Bolts 2, I would be totally fine. I would be okay with that. I just want something else, man. This game was great. This game was it was given a bad rep. It was, people wrote it off because it wasn't like the typical Banjo games. And that's disappointing because the game is great. You have to be someone who is creative. You have to be someone who can think outside of the box. But the game itself is fantastic. I love the game. If you are someone who likes to be creative, if you like to let those creative muscles flow, definitely go for it. Just give it a chance. It's a great game. I love it. Banjo's Gizmos and Gadgets for Nuts and Bolts too. Yeah, Nuts and Bolts is way better than most. Everyone just hears but Nuts and Bolts and they go like, oh, that's the bad Banjo game, isn't it? Well, have you tried it? No, but that's what I heard. And then, I mean, as long as you set up their expectations right going into it, it's a great game. Look, the feel, the characters, the aesthetics. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. Thank you, Levny. All right. Well, that'll be the end. Yeah, I didn't really touch on the Banjo Kazooie Game Boy Advance games. I very, very briefly touched on Grunty's Revenge and Banjo Pilot, but I don't really know much about them. And I didn't have as much time to research them. And it was going to be a light over touch. Like they were basically spin-off games because they consider Banjo to be the third game. So I didn't do a lot of research into them. But basically, Banjo Pilots, from what I heard, was not that great. Banjo Grundy's Revenge was great. It just suffered from being on the Game Boy Advance where they lacked depth perception. So that's the only issue that I heard. But I guess that'll be the end of Design of Play, episode 4, where we discuss Banjo Nuts and Bolts. The next episode we will be talking about will be Yooka Laylee. I figure we continue into the platformer genre, and it happens to be made by the exact same people. And it was also a very controversial game. It had a lot of mixed perception from people, having a desire for a traditional Banjo Kazooie platformer for a while. We had Yooka Laylee, which was a fan-created, a fan-funded game. Sorry, not fan-created, fan-funded game. A crowdsourced game. And it had very mixed reviews. We will discuss if it turns out that the mixed reviews were because of the final product of the game was lacking, or if it was just a sign of the times changing, where, 3D platformers are just something that most people aren't exactly looking for. So hopefully you will be there for the next discussion that we take part in then. I appreciate you watching. If you are watching on YouTube, thank you so much. We have these discussions on Twitch, and I also play through all the games on Twitch as well, so you can be there to watch me do it there. I think that's pretty much it. You guys are fantastic. I appreciate it. Have a wonderful day.